Good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. Can everyone hear? Okay, perfect. I'm Peter Goodman. I write about the global economy for the New York Times, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel on inequality in economic and political systems. And I must, despite the fact that this has already been well covered, add my voice to the appreciation for our host, Joe Stiglitz, and offer my congratulations for this anniversary. I have spent most of my time with Joe in Davos, where he became the only heroic character of a book I wrote a couple years ago called Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World. And as I would wander around listening to fabulously wealthy people's suggestions on how to deal with inequality, Ray Dalio, Unleash the Animal Spirits, Arianna Huffington, people have to sleep more and put on skin creams that sponsor my website. I would run into Joe, and Joe would be the one sort of voice of sanity who would say, well, what they're really saying is they don't want to pay any taxes. And I, like many of you, have had the pleasure of reading Joe's books over the years. And I think what Joe's voice and analysis, not that it can be encompassed in a couple of sentences, but what it means to me sort of most fundamentally in terms of the subject that we're here to talk about is nothing happens of consequence by accident. The systems that we're living in, the outcomes that define our lives have been engineered by and large. You don't need to be a conspiracy theorist to feel this way. You can just look around. Have been engineered by powerful interests to shape the world further in their interest. And I think you can suffice to say that in terms of this question of democracy that we're here to get into further, building on previous panels, wealthy people have managed to use their wealth to purchase political power. They've used their political power to tilt the rules further in their direction. And while I think that, you say economics to an ordinary person and they think numbers on a chart, or, if they're thinking about ordinary people, the price of eggs or wages, and these are important things. But I think what Joe's work and the work of the people I'm lucky enough to have on this panel brings home really is what economics is fundamentally about if you're doing it the right way and thinking about it properly. It's about power. It's about whose voice matters, who has the power to write the rules for whose benefit. And finally, before we get into it, I just want to note that we're sitting here in the city that is most commercially significant in the wealthiest nation on earth by many measures. This is a country that is powerful enough to send people into space, to play war games, and yet right around us, around this incredibly prestigious university, are neighborhoods where there are infant mortality levels that are roughly equal to Sri Lanka. That's incredible. I mean, that's probably known to many of you. And yet I think it's important to frame our discussion with that in mind, that we're in a country where some people own homes the way most of us own socks, and yet there are people all around us who don't have enough to eat, who are worrying about how they're going to go to the doctor when the time comes. And we live in a society where, as a consequence of these kind of familiar contrast stories, there are an awful lot of wacky, angry ideas, such that a social media post can prompt people to show up at a pizzeria in Maryland thinking that there's a Clinton-run pedophile ring, or show up at a village in India convinced that people of another religious faith or tribe have to be murdered because they're trying to murder us. And all of this is grounded, I think it's fair to say, in inequality. And that's a pretty big problem. And what do we do about it? Well, we've got a really terrific group of people to chew on these questions. Immediately to my left, Winnie Byanyima, Byanyima, Executive Director of UNAIDS, Under Secretary General of the United Nations, Ravi Kanbur, Professor at Cornell University, Branko Milanović, Professor at the City University of New York, Binaifer Nowrojee, President of the Open Society Foundation. Great to have you all. We're going to take a couple of minutes with these presentations, and then we should just bat around questions about the compatibility of democracy and inequality. Winnie, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Peter. I also want to say congratulations to you, Joe. I have always admired how you make decisions, how to use your knowledge, your ideas, your experience. I've watched you. You say you are an academic, but I've been with you in so many spaces, navigating with policymakers, with presidents, in Davos, shaming the billionaires, and then with movements. I come from movements, but you don't have any difficulty working with us from social movements, even though you keep saying I'm an academic. So the way you choose who to work with, to use your knowledge to influence the world, is what I have the greatest respect for you for that. One last thing is, very clever people like you, there's something that gets in their way. They are not very influential because they can't manage their egos. You have so little ego, Joe. I think your power lies there. So I'm going to say three things. First, that political and economic inequality are not separate. They are not separate problems. They're very tied together. The richest 1% have seen, this is Oxfam statistics, I never stop quoting Oxfam, they have seen their wealth increase by $34 trillion in the last 10 years. $34 trillion their wealth has increased. Now, when some of us argue that for a billionaire to buy a super yacht, to buy paintings for $50 million while people are starving, that's wrong. We are accused of the politics of envy. Fine. But when a billionaire, as Peter was saying, buys a politician, when a billionaire buys a media empire, takes over the voice of the people, when he buys impunity from justice, this should worry all of us, including those who believe in free markets. This is the issue. I keep quoting Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. Some of you will know this quote when he said, we can have a democratic society, or we can have the concentration of great wealth in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. This is it. This is my first point, that these two are so tied together, and I thank Joe for bringing back this issue of the capture of democracies by oligarchy. The second point I wanted to make is, I think we have underestimated how much monopoly power drives inequality at the expense of people's rights and lives. In my world of health, where I work, we see this. Take the case of medicines. In COVID, pharma created 40 new billionaires. How? Because the companies, not the governments, not WHO, decided which countries would get the vaccines, how much to produce for the whole world. 1.3 million deaths could have been prevented had companies, monopolies, not taken the role of decision maker over life and death. And it's still happening. Today we have a new innovation. It's called lenacapavir in our world of HIV. This is the closest to a vaccine for HIV, for AIDS. 2 shots in the arm every year give 100% protection from HIV. But Gilead, the owner of the technology, have priced it at $28,000 per person per year. It's unaffordable for the people who need it. Girls in Africa, LGBTQ people hiding from the laws in all these countries, and yet it will be produced for $25 per person per year time. So there we are. We are in a situation where rules were created. These rules have taken the right to life and put it in the hands of companies, not governments, not international organizations like WHO. When we had the COVID crisis, WHO could declare a World Health Emergency, but the decision about producing the vaccines, we had to go to WTO. Neoliberals have created institutions, given them power that should not be their power. Why should medicines be sold the way you sell a diamond ring? Life-saving medicines. Why should the rules around health be made by WTO? So these are the things, let me conclude. The third point is that we are not powerless. We can change these rules. The work of this institute shows that bit by bit you can keep pushing against the rules that are so unjust. We can change the rules on taxation and close tax loopholes. We can change the rules on intellectual property rights and put them in the right institution of health for health. We can get health out of the trade rules that don't recognize human rights and have them set somewhere else. We can change the rules. We have the power to do so. On inequality, I believe that we need an institution that will track it, that will put out the policies that can reduce it, both at the global level and between countries and within countries, and keep the world on its feet on reducing extreme inequality. We can do this, and President Ramaphosa has invited Professor Stiglitz, Jayati, myself, and a few others to what he calls an extraordinary committee on global wealth inequality. Really, if that committee can give to the G20 a proposal on institutionalizing, finding a way to keep attention on global inequality and how it's rising and how to reduce it, that will be, for me, a huge outcome. And I invite you all to support such an idea. Thank you. I'm sorry for taking too long.
Ravi, please.
Good, thank you. It's okay. I had a PowerPoint, but I think I'll just speak. It's probably better. So, just to start saying, Joe and I go back a long way. Joe was my thesis advisor at Oxford, and then 20 years after that, I found myself. My title was Principal Advisor to the Chief Economist of the World Bank, and who should become the Chief Economist of the World Bank but Joseph Stiglitz. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's how I became Principal Advisor to my thesis advisor. Anyway, I've been very proud to be associated with IPD right from the start, and it's been fantastic. So the chart that I've been given in the email that we received was actually something very specific, and I'm going to be quite something very specific, but I hope that general issues will be raised from that specific discussion. And the specific point is the following, which is that in the last 25 years or so, I would say that there's been a shift in stance away from what might term the social democratic consensus of vigorous redistribution of market incomes through tax and transfer towards doing something before the market kicks human capital, education, and all that sort of stuff. Okay? There's been that shift in stuff. It's not either or, it's not whatever, but it's very clear to me that in the policy discourse and in the analytical literature, there's been this shift in that direction. And I would say that there are three reasons. And of course, the right always says, don't do redistribution. What's interesting is that amongst the egalitarian group as well, it's now do less of that, but do more of this other thing. There's been this unmistakable shift in that direction. And that's really what I want to critique, what I want to argue against. And I would say that in the literature I located, there are three main reasons why this shift is happening. One is all the problems that we economists know about taxation, incentives, information costs, compliance, all of that sort of stuff, which of course, that's our bread and butter, right? That sort of stuff. And I think that's underpinned, that has analytically underpinned the shift. Indeed, the Merle's review, Tony Atkinson credits the Merle's review with underpinning George Osborne's reduction of the top marginal tax rate in the UK from 50% to 40% and so on. Okay? So there's been this link between this analytical concern about these incentive effects and the shift. The second is a moral philosophical argument, which comes with John Romer and others, that somehow, because market incomes involve individual effort, individual effort translates pre-market human capital into post-market income, and we have no ethical right to touch that which has been generated by individual effort. Okay, that's the old opportunity outcomes type of it. Equalized opportunity, yes, but equalized outcomes, no. There's a moral philosophical basis to that shift. And the third one I would say is a political economy basis, which is, the population as a whole somehow, for whatever reason, seems to prefer this type of redistribution to that type. So, you're an egalitarian. Why do you want to bash your head against brick wall? Just go with the flow. That seems to be the third type of argument. And I would question each of those arguments. And that's what I want to do very quickly. Firstly, on the first sort of standard economist type, I would say make the following points, and there are papers behind this. Just because redistributing post-market income is difficult, doesn't mean redistributing other things is easy. Okay? There are indeed incentive effects when you try to redistribute education. The distribution of public expenditure on education is not totally egalitarian, and so on and so forth. And when you think about effective market human capital being generated both by public inputs and private inputs, schooling plus piano lessons, okay, then the redistribution of market income turns out to be indeed a way of affecting the redistribution of human capital. So one cannot make that easy break between the two. So that would be my first set of critiques of this shift in this direction. The second, in terms of the moral aspect of it, it goes back to John Romer's distinction between circumstance and effort. Circumstance is that which is outside the individual's control. Effort is that which is the individual's control. So even the terminology gives it away. Okay? And the ethical position is you have no right to touch that variation of income which is attributable to variations in effort. Circumstance, yes, but effort, no. Well, I challenge you empirically to try to make a distinction, econometrically, empirically between those two things. That's the first point. But secondly, conceptually, I challenge you to begin to think about this distinction. Okay? Imagine yourself being on a soup line, and as the indigents move towards you, and you hand this cup of soup, the equality opportunity police step in and say, the reason why this person is the way that person is not because of circumstance, because of effort. He drank away his fortune, whatever. In what moral universe would you pull away that cup of soup from that person just because the outcome was the result of the individual's effort, not circumstance? Okay? And if you grant me that intuition is a problem, then I can use that philosophically to actually drive a coach and horses through this type of argument. The other thing I would say, again from a conceptual point of view, is what happens when one person's effort becomes another person's circumstance. Okay? When parents' effort becomes a child's circumstance, or the chief executive's decision, independently taken, affects the workers' outcomes. For all of those sorts of conceptual reasons as well, I think there's a basic problem with this circumstance-effort distinction, which underlies the shift, I would say, shift away from post-market redistribution to pre-market. The final point I'd make, and this is where I think the critics do have a point on the political economy dimension of it, okay, which is the population, for whatever reasons, you prefer one to the other. And I think we have to try and understand that part. And here I think what's important is something that Santiago Ravi and I have written about, which is that the social form, the form of the distribution, the form of the redistribution seems to matter as much as the actual outcome of the redistribution. You can have two packages, A and B, which lead to the same final outcome in distribution, and yet for whatever reason, A is preferred to B. Or you can have a package which checks all our economist boxes of efficiency, equity, and so on and so forth, and yet for whatever reason, population somehow doesn't seem to want it. The classic example of this is a proposal to have carbon taxes and redistribute the revenue equally amongst everybody. Okay? And when that proposal is put to people, they reject it. It's intergenerationally efficient, whatever, and you're redistributing it equally amongst people. Yet people reject it. And we have to try and understand why that is the case, because the form of the redistribution matters for the social acceptability. And we as economists, I don't really understand that. So for all of these reasons, I think the shift in stance away from post-market redistribution, which I believe was the social democratic consensus, away towards this other thing, which is as much within egalitarian circles as within conventional right-wing circles, I believe has to be examined and has to be resisted. Thank you.
Or 1990 conference in Italy on transition economies. One thing that was actually they were beginning to be called transition economies. And one of the things that I clearly remember is that Joe was the only one who was skeptical about privatization. He was the only one who said, actually, look at the way that you privatize, don't be extraordinarily optimistic, as we all were, and take care of who gets the assets. And he had a paper which was in Latin, the title is like, who is controlling the custodians? And I remember that. That was the first time that we met. Now, I will speak of something which is actually in my new book, which is called Coming Out on November the 7th. That was a day in terms of days. One day, Trump was elected November the 6th. The October Revolution took place November the 7th. Obviously different years, and I don't think the book is going to be as influential, but I think the choice of the date is not purely accidental. No, the objective of the book, which is called The Great Global Transformation, is to bring two levels of analysis which are there but have not been brought together. One is that at the level of nation states, we have had a major transformation of the world economy with the rise of Asia and China in particular. So I don't need to tell everybody about that here. That's quite enough. The second level is that has had an impact, and I will show that in a minute, on global income positions of different people. If, to put it very, very simply, if China goes ahead, that means that lots of people actually are going through the global income distribution, reshuffling the global income distribution, and people who used to be ahead of them now become below them. That's very simple logic, and that's what actually has happened. Now, let me illustrate that the first level of nation states. This is the graph which shows total GDP in PPP terms for four pairs of the economies. The first one, and the only one that I will talk about, is the US and China. And you know that China has overtaken the United States by the total output. I think in 2015, it's producing now 22% of the global output. US is producing 15%. What was interesting, of course, the same thing was happening between other Asian versus Western countries. And of course, the example that I really like a lot, because people don't talk about that, is India versus the UK. In 1980, both of them were producing 3% of the global output. India is now producing 9%, UK is producing 2%. I mean, we are really going through a transformation which is equivalent to the Industrial Revolution. And in the microdata, which of course I use, which I'll not show you today, actually that's what you see. You see in the 19th century, huge increase in inequality because of the rise of the West, and you see in the last 30 years, a significant, important decline in global inequality because of rise of India, China, and so forth. And they're really, I mean, almost sort of, how should I say, not equivalent, but they're almost like analogs. In one case, you have the industrialization of India. In this case, you have the industrialization of the United States. So that's the first level. And of course, what it did actually at the level of, if I can get this to, at the level of individuals, it has really transformed the distribution. So again, here, it's not there. What happened? If you look at the global income distribution, it used to be shifted towards the left, where actually most of the poor people from poor countries were. Nowadays, the distribution, well, okay, it's coming. Well, that's really a beauty of this technology. If you look at 2018, and I have now 2023 data as well, the distribution of the world for the first time, I think, in 200 years, looks more or less log normal, which is like normal, which is the usual distributions of the countries. And why does it look like log normal? Because you had people from Asia moving from that point on the left, which is very poor incomes, towards the middle. So now, this is not the middle class in the Western sense, because they are much poorer. They are under $10,000 per person per year, but it's a medium class. And you see that, that thickness in the middle, which did not exist 30 years ago. So that is a change at the global level of individuals. And then final graph is the one that I actually already mentioned indirectly, is the greatest reshuffling of incomes. On the left-hand side, you have, on the horizontal axis, you have 10 Chinese urban deciles. And on the vertical axis, you have their position in the global income distribution. Now, it's like no-brainer that obviously China has grown at 8% a year for 30 years. They were going to go up. So the blue line is 1988, the red line is 2018. So they all went up. You know, the top decile, for example, went up from the 70th percentile to the 96th or 70th. Okay, we all know that. But what's the implication of that? If they went up in the ordinal ranking, somebody has to go down. So my favorite example is Italy. Italy has not grown for 25 years. You know, inequality in Italy has not increased dramatically at all. But what has happened? The bottom deciles of Italian income distribution just went all down. So they used to be, the bottom used to be 67th percentile, now it's a 55th percentile. So what has happened with the rise, and let's stop here, with the rise of Asia and China are two effects. The first one is at the level of nation states, where the convergence of mean incomes actually leads to conflict. So when you say to people, do you like to have convergence of mean incomes? They say, yes, I like it. But really what happens is a conflict between large countries like the US and China. At the level of individuals, it leads to the formation of something which is called global middle class, but it leads also to the decline of the lower parts of the income distribution of the rich countries. And that, of course, means domestic turmoil. So two positive developments of convergence lead in one case to conflict, and in the other case to domestic difficulties. And that's the main story of the book. As I was saying to Martin yesterday, it's like the kind of reverse Mendeleev. Thank you.
Thanks. So good afternoon to everyone. So I had an organization called Open Society Foundations, which is George Soros's philanthropy. So the philanthropy of a billionaire, and with all the contradictions that comes with. And the mandate of our organization is really the promotion of open society values in societies, human rights, equity, justice. So the way we approach our work on economics really comes through the lens of open society values. And as you can imagine, at this point, in this moment in history, I think what we're really seeing is a volatile and fractured world where open society is really under threat. Not that it hasn't been in the past, but we're, I think, seeing a retreat to those values. And so how are we looking at this moment? I think the first thing is we're doing probably more on economic rights than the organization has ever done in its 40-plus year history, because we are seeing the links between inequality and economics and how it's impacting on democratic space. And what we are seeing also is democracies devouring themselves as a consequence of that. And so it's very much part and parcel of our mandate now. And so what are we doing? And I think the first thing that we've always done is we seek to move power. We seek to move power to voices that have never been in the center or have not been able to have access to change things. And the second thing at a moment like this is we are looking for the people who have the moral imagination to think about how we can get to the change. I'm actually, I think it's without being, too pessimistic, I actually think there's many openings and there's many opportunities for us to do things. And I think where like-minded people can come together, there's really scope with imagination to try and think about things. I think some of the things that are different in the world that we've not faced before as we look at where we're at. The first thing is the changing demographic. One of the first times in history where we've got societies where older people exceed working people, and that's creating its own dynamic. And in those societies, you see the impact of that. The second thing is, this is the first time in history that women are now outnumbering men in university matriculation and coming out of universities, which means that in the next decade, the number of qualified women who are going to be able to seek power, take jobs, move up, they have access to opportunity that has never been there before. This is another dynamic that is playing on what we're seeing. And so when we look at this, what is the impact on politics, on economics with these two phenomena? And what I see as I look at the globe and the work we're doing, the first thing I see is that it kind of breaks into two. We're seeing spaces with a lot of young people where there's a youth bulge, where there's energy. And in those societies, it's not that they don't have challenges. There's huge challenges, huge political challenges, huge poverty, huge economic inequality, and yet there's energy, there's optimism, there's young people, and I think Nepal is the most recent, young people coming out on the streets and toppling governments that have historically been autocratic or corrupt or despotic, and yet when you talk to them in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Senegal, they're talking the language of open society, and these are young people who've never even seen a democracy, and yet they can imagine it. And so there, I feel there's real energy for us to think about how we assist these young people to actually go from being protesters on the street with the concepts of open society to skill up, to actually be able to seize opportunities and then ultimately govern these societies in a different way. The second group that I'm seeing are societies where you have a dearth of younger people. And here you feel the entropy, you feel the disaffection, you see the response is polarization, it's blame, it's looking for scapegoats, it's feeling victimized, people who've previously, and this is, I see it particularly in the US, but also you find it in Europe, and it's leading to the rise of very extremist right-wing politics that are exclusionary. The idea of winner take all, somebody else's win is my loss, and therefore my gain is to exclude others. And so just to say very quickly, and I'll wind up, what is Open Society Foundations? How are we addressing this? So the first thing is, I think that we are looking for models of shared prosperity, the idea that we're all one human race, and how do we actually have something that's a win-win. We're looking inside countries. How do we help to kind of build and advance alternate economic models? And here we've put $400 million towards trying to assist and build governments that are interested. Places like Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, Senegal, Malaysia, governments that are facing huge challenges. Got the time note. I will wrap up quickly. To how can they begin to think about really new economic development? And we're working with governments, which is also unusual for us. Usually we work with civil society groups, movements to do that. So where we can, we work inside countries. We also see hope for working between countries. Someone mentioned critical minerals. In Africa, we have a huge program now that's beginning to help to think about ways African governments can leapfrog into wealth using their wealth, their mineral wealth of critical minerals. And how can we help policymakers, others, artisanal miners, many of them women who've generally not seen any part of the value chain to actually benefit from it. And then at the multilateral level, how do we just help to address some of the entrenched power structures in global governance? So looking at how do we help build national development banks? How do we stop vulture creditors from taking advantage of debt-distressed countries? How do we help support the Catholic Church around its Jubilee 2025? How do we push to get movements around minimum wealth tax? And finally, where are the new multilateral spaces where there's energy? And so some of them have been mentioned, but we don't live in a unipolar world anymore. The US is on the decline. We don't even live in a G7 world now. We're living in a G20 world. We're living in a BRICS world. We're living in spaces where new forms of global organization are happening. How can we influence them to move the needle towards human rights, equity, and justice? Thank you.
Thank you for not saying that we're living in a G0, with apologies to Ian Bremer. I want to come back to this point that you're making, Winnie, in citing that famous Justice Brandeis quote about how we can't have concentrated wealth and democracy at the same time. I'm mangling the quote, but you get the point. Because implicit in a lot of the discussion here throughout the day is, I think it's fair to say, something that we all generally believe, which is that there is a point at which economic inequality is so great that it is a threat to democracy, and many people would say we've already passed that point in our own society. But I guess I'm coming at this from the standpoint of someone who lived in China for 6 years, right around the time of China's WTO entry. And I remember covering the visits of people like Hank Paulson, other American officials who would come to China saying some version of, you need to move faster with your reforms, you specifically have to liberalize the capital market, and you're doing this because in coordination with people who would talk about human rights and more freedom of expression, they would say, information is part of the market. And the implication was quite direct, that not only, and this is, of course is very familiar, would trade with China make China more like us in the West, though we know how that story worked out, but that China itself would become more prosperous by becoming more like us, because democracy is, in part, a way to get richer. It's a way to live better. And that is a long-winded way of asking all of you how your own views about democracy have changed, if at all, in this period. Branko, very specifically, you've done work examining the differences between development in China and other parts of the world. I'm not breaking any news here to say that China's model, whatever you think of it, whether you want to live in the People's Republic of China or not, has very successfully lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. The same people who went over to Beijing to lecture Chinese officials on the need to be more like us now have to explain how we have had a giant financial crisis in our own country, We now have a lifting of all sorts of norms and what some people would describe as crony capitalism. So given that context, what are we to make of the whole point of democracy? Is democracy the means to making society more prosperous? Is it an end in itself? And how have your own views changed? Why don't we start with you, Winnie, since you gave us the Brandeis quote?
An interesting question. When you American people voted for Trump and came to power, we in Africa were watching you, and we were quite amused because he created his first cabinet was 1/3 billionaires, and his policies were pro-billionaires, not pro the ordinary people who had voted for him. And then we started to see you being so shocked at how he would treat the democracy, the rules, the courts, the state powers, and we would see this especially through comedy. There was a guy called Trevor Noah, an African man doing your show here. And Trevor Noah one day decided to compare Trump to Idi Amin. And Americans were offended. How could their president of a democratic country be compared to an African dictator? But that is how we see your democracy. Captured, just like ours. But yours, it's masked. Companies, big interests, pay your politicians, but it is lawful and it is seen as okay to lobby, to pay a lot of money, pharmaceuticals, finance sector, they all pay, agricultural sector, they all pay money to your politicians. So it's a democracy of interests, special interest groups, powerful interests. It's captured by the super rich, by interest groups, but it's all legal. So it's accepted. Whereas for us, out in Africa, for example, it's a continent of inequality today. 6 African men own as much wealth as half, the lowest half of the Africans, the poorest half. 7 of the most unequal countries in the world are African. 7 out of 10. Our democracies are so totally captured, it's so visible. You know, they pour money into elections, they pay soap and salt for people, they beat up people with guns and whatever. So we see the capture through violence and through bribery and all of that. It's not through the rules. So I think that if I can come back to your question, you need an open and free society for innovation. But you also need a state. You need states that have the power to regulate, to make policies that equalize people and that protect the democracy. It seems to me that you have rich countries, the liberal democracies, have lost that capacity to create a democratic space for more innovation, for distribution. And in that sense, I see that Branko's curve. It's about a country that's not democratic at all, China, the Asian countries, but which are able to have developmental governments that are driving or giving direction to innovation. But I don't think that this can last very long without democracy. I think there are rises there, but without making progress on creating a free society, they cannot keep that leadership. But they are leading because the liberal democracies are in decline, they are captured. Their democracy is failing, their capacity to lead is decreasing.
Yeah, you have perhaps something of a minor contrarian view on the, particularly in terms of conventional measures of democracy, and then we run a regression with those measures on the right-hand side and growth on the left-hand side and so on and so forth. So it actually emerges out of my own work on China. So 30 years ago, Zhabo Zhang and I joined many other people who were pointing out that inequality in China was rising dramatically. We were using conventional household survey methods and so on. Then about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, Zhabo and I, we repeated our work, and we found that actually inequality in China, using the same methods, the same data, same whatever, was actually beginning to plateau. And maybe even maybe a little turn down. Okay? So 30 years ago when we published our stuff, there were sort of protests from back other people saying, look, this country is growing at such a fantastic rate, the best performance of poverty reduction ever known. Why are you spoiling the party by talking about rising inequality and so on and so forth? And the view that we took at the time was, look, it's like if you don't understand this particular aspect of the economy, it's like you don't understand inflation or something. It's an aspect of economic development. So then when we started publishing our other stuff, there were sort of protests from the other side saying, don't you, just walking down the streets in Shanghai, you can see the inequality and so on. How come so there must be something problem with the data and so on. It's the same data that was used 30 years ago, which of course everybody then said. Anyway, I was very much influenced by a comment that Bin Wong made. Bin Wong is a very distinguished historian of China. He said that concern about inequality is hardwired into the Chinese state. Said when you're ruling an empire which has vociferous tendencies and people nibbling at the thing, you always worry about what's happening at the edges. So he said whenever there was an uprising in one of the outlying provinces, the center did two things. It sent in the army and it sent in the agricultural engineers, development engineers to develop the place and so on. So his view 25 years ago was that this sharp uptick in Chinese inequality was in fact an aberration. That this would, in some sense, correct itself, was his view, because actually, even though all the conventional measures of democracy, blah, 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 the regime, in terms of its own survival, has to worry about these sorts of factors. So that has always stuck with me. Okay? And 35 years, 40 years is a long time to have a high growth rate. And for it not to disappear, and to say that, well, eventually it's going to, because of lack of democracy. Yeah, I think there's something else going on here, and perhaps a slightly cautious view on conventional measures of democracy and their relationship to development and so on might be in order. Anyway, thank you.
Well, that sets things up perfectly for the question.
Well, I would actually, first of all, in reference to what Ravi said, I think that the increase of inequality, which is undeniable in China from like 1978 or 1980, was also somewhat of an anomaly because the previous regime was anomalously equal. Like, for example, the lowest Gini coefficient that I've seen of anywhere was urban China 1982 of Gini of 18. There is no, the least unequal countries that I've seen otherwise, it's like Austria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Finland, Gini of 22, 23. Nobody had the Gini which is under 20. So then obviously now China is actually higher inequality than the US. But part of that was actually the return to normalcy protocol. Now, let me answer the question that you asked specifically individual journeys about democracy. I was never particularly sort of concerned about democracy, but let me say, put it in Rawlsian terms. In a theory of justice, democracy is a primary. And Rawls does not allow for the trade-off between economic growth or income and democracy. That sounds very good. But then what economists don't like is that he is explicitly speaking against economic growth as being an objective of a society, where he says explicitly it's the objective of the business class. So he denies the essential feature that we economists believe, that actually economic growth and income and wealth are going to make people happier, healthier, better. So we do have this problem with growth. And I, in my mind, have sort of solved it, but essentially believing that you actually put that very well, that democracy is a tool. That there is a trade-off between the two, and democracy is a tool toward the achievement of happiness, which is linked with economic growth. But it's a tool.
Well, this sort of started with you, but since you are actively promoting democracy as a good.
So I think we are now in a world where that kind of binary is confounding us, right? I mean, if you call the United States a democracy and you look at the behaviors of this government that is in power currently, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that it's democratic practice, not just inside the country, but even its impact globally in terms of, for instance, the conflict in Gaza and the sanctioning of ICC judges, etc. So I think that what we have to do is it's an aspirational thing. There are even the most democratic spaces, there are places to improve, etc. And I think that we have to look at democratic practice as an indicator and think about how democratic practice is to be upheld. The second thing I would say, so just to go back to that, I think free elections where the majority now vote for an undemocratic leader is another phenomenon we're seeing right now. We see it here, we see it in India. Second thing is that I think when I look at the way younger people are organizing for democratic aspirations, they are organizing very differently, and I think that's something we also have to look at. I think technology and the social media space, I think these leaderless movements that are coming up that are overthrowing governments peacefully when they come out on the streets, these are all new phenomena that we're seeing that I think we don't understand fully. And so I would say, I would urge us not to simply use a moniker democracy, but just understand democratic practice is what we're aiming for.
Thank you. I think there's a fairly widespread view around the world in amongst the public that, I would personally suggest represents the triumph of lobbying, but it goes something like, we can either have the good things, vaccines, central air conditioning, the internet, and then we accept inequality, or we can monkey around with the innovation and the animal spirits, and we end up like Venezuela. That's obviously a cartoonish depiction, but I think that really does describe the way in which the billionaire class has managed to insulate itself from things like wealth taxes. And I'm curious to know, in light of earlier discussions, like, is there a scenario, to come back to the point that we're making about the breakdown of the social welfare consensus, is there a scenario where, okay, Jeff Bezos owns a bunch of yachts, and Elon Musk can afford to have an entire compound for his children and their moms. And we have extreme inequality, and we have innovation, but we also have national health care, if you will, Nordic-style job training and transition and worker protection programs, where we have all of the good things, if you will, innovation, growth, some redistribution so that the bottom isn't sleeping under highway overpasses, and we carry on. What are the choices sort of on the menu? And then we'll open it up to the audience.
There is a data point I like to give, which is about a child, or rather the life expectancy, under 5 life expectancy for a child, under 5 life expectancy for African American poor in this country is lower or about the same as under 5 life expectancy for Libya. Think about that. The richest country in the world, we have been amongst one category of people, the health of children is like that of a child in Libya on average. So there are choices there that this democracy that represents special interests doesn't represent a whole lot of people at the base. I used to talk about women working in the poultry industry in Arkansas that we worked with at Oxfam, who would cut those chickens for hours and hours and develop a numbness in their fingers. They could hold their babies because they did so much chopping the chickens. And then they would go to do a second and a third job. So it's a democracy, but it's a democracy that serves the interests of the very, very wealthy and the interest groups. So the choice is there that it works for them, but doesn't work for everybody else. I think that in the developing world, it's even worse. It's even worse in many parts of the developing world because the resources are, or the countries have got low technology. They have few solutions to the most basic problems, but the capture at the top is for the benefit of such a small number of people that the deprivation at the bottom keeps getting worse and worse. The inequality is bigger in relative terms. So I think that you need democracy in order to be able to have public policies that reflect or address the needs of the majority. And it's not either or. You must have the democracy in order to address and you keep bringing China, but China may be a country which has lifted its majority out of poverty, but to me, this widening inequality in their country doesn't bode well for these gains. I don't think these gains will increase, lifting more and more people out of poverty and becoming more and more prosperous. So we need democracy in order to have a society that is stable, that's cohesive, and that is growing.
Yeah, so I want to relate an answer to your question to this new technology, the less use of labor, yet the dignity of work being so important to earn, etc., etc. Doing a paper just now called "What if all the output of the world was produced by one person?" Okay, and ergo, all the income in the world goes to that one person, which is the direction that we might be heading in, and that's the person who has the yachts and so on and so forth. So it goes back to my point that actually, the point that I made, that the social form of the redistribution matters, and whether it's acceptable or not matters. And that is a social construct. And who's to say that the dignity of work business isn't a social construct? Okay? That you're being paid a low wage, it's so dignified. Okay? In whose interest is that particular constellation? Okay? So maybe the whole notion of the dignity of work, of going to a factory and working in this way, is itself a social construct. And it's a historical product of a particular historical thing. If we were to wake up magically one morning, and it was the case that no matter who produces the output, that's just a side issue, it is then distributed. And actually, the state of Alaska has a universal basic income. It's a permanent fund, where every Alaskan receives a check. And it's not that it reduces their dignity or anything like that. It's their right. And that's because that's a socialization. It's a particular social construct. Okay? So I think we have to think in those terms, that we're dealing with the redistributive issues of a new age with the social constructs which were developed, in fact, to actually underpin an earlier age, where dignity of work, quote unquote, I would say, was needed in order to keep those factories and those markets and so on going. Thank you.
Okay, very briefly. First, I would like to, maybe I'm just a little bit exhausted of talks about inequality in 30 years. But you know, we are always blaming it to somebody else. But you know, if I look, because I work with global inequality data, if I look at this room, everybody here is a global top 1%. So we have to realize that. So the problem, we met the problem, and the problem is us. So that's the first point. The second point, I would like actually to address very briefly something on China. Historically, the countries that have been most successful in some way, economically, politically, militarily, were projecting their model, whether they were able to project it, you know, through force, or whether they were imitating. The interesting part about China, there is no doubt it's the most successful country in the last 50 years. Now, what is the model they can export? And I think that's essentially the problem. And I recently read a very interesting piece that was written, she's a Singaporean, Yuan Yong-Eng. And she basically criticized everything that we criticize here about, like, essentially the Washington consensus, neoliberalism, and so on. But then when she comes back to what to do, she essentially says, well, the countries have to optimize given the resources they have. But you know, this is not an advice that you can give. You go to Tanzania and say, optimize with what you have. Like, what is this? Like, nothing. So the issue which I see with China is really packaging, and very difficult to package, because China's success was the result of really discrete decisions that were very often made on the spot, and there was no blueprint. And there was lots of, as you know, experimentation. Like, this province does that, the other province does that. The system of incentives was very specific. The single party was very specific. So it's very hard for them to project. I think one country that they succeeded to some extent was Ethiopia. But I don't see other examples. And I think that's the problem, that the export of their commodity, which is, you know, governance, so China, is very difficult. And so far as it doesn't happen, we only have the West.
Yeah, just to say, I think that I would make the argument, and I think this is the argument that motivated George Soros to set up his philanthropy. He had to flee Nazi Germany. He lost relatives, and in essence, wealth didn't protect him. And ultimately, the realization that your wealth will not protect you when a society is so discontented that ultimately it collapses, or there's only so many gates and walls and restrictions you can hold. At a certain point, that discontent explodes into violence, and wealth cannot protect you completely anymore. And it's in the self-interest of all to have a common good, to have a shared humanity. And I think if we make that argument, and there's only so many places you can keep moving, and yes, you can move to Mars even, but ultimately I think that there's just too many people for this model to continue. This is what we're facing. It's ultimately the collapse of where we are.
Let's take some questions from the audience. Please do introduce yourselves and questions, please. Yes, sir. Is there a microphone?
So I just have a question about the framing the economy and democracy, or inequality and democracy, which takes with it this idea that democracy is about governments organizing the base of the nation, doing something for everybody's interest. Inequality is a thing that's economic and arises out of individuals, produces a distribution. From a legal point of view, it's very difficult to distinguish the institutions that are part of one and part of the other. And so I'm just wondering what difference you think it would make if we started to think about economic institutions as being forms of political arrangement or social forms in the way that you suggested. And we thought about governmental institutions as being institutions of distribution, economic institutions of some kind, including the distributions that are wrought by the division of the world into states with certain kinds of governmental capacities. So it's that idea that democracy is something that's about government and inequality is something that's about the management of an economy that seems to me getting in our way. And so I just wonder if you have reactions to the idea of thinking democracy in the domain of economics and politics in the domain of what we usually call the political or government.
I think you are talking about economic inequality, but when I talk about democracy, I'm also thinking about political inequality, inequality of voice, inequality of security, inequality of participation, being part of decision making. These are inequalities that exist where there's no democracy, right? Inequality of rights. So I think when we talk about democracy and economic inequality, we must remember that there are also other inequalities that we are referring to in terms of democracy and the absence of those of voice, of human rights, of affects, also reflects in economic inequality. But I think we must not forget the other inequalities.
Thank you. This is a question to Branko, just trying to understand your book, which sounds fascinating. I look forward to reading. When you say that inequality, you show those graphs, is the increase in inequality, for example, Italy, that's between Italy and China, or are you also saying something about the distribution within Italy as the source of growing social tensions? Because it seems to me that Italians or British don't really care about what the Chinese are earning. They care about internal distribution of things. And then if that is the case, have you got data on place? Because all the evidence I'm looking at is it's very, very place specific. So you could have income, the Gini is not changing at the national level, but then when you look at place Gini, you get very sharp increases, and I think that's at the heart of it. You also suggested that declines internationally were a source of conflict or potential source of conflict. I'm interested on the evidence of that, and I think it's, again, very place specific. For example, relative places changing within Europe have not increased tensions within Europe. They've reduced them, say, between Portugal and Greece and Germany, or the UK. Whereas I think, are you suggesting that somehow this convergence is going to inevitably lead to conflict globally? I think it's just a bit too brief for me to understand what you're really saying.
It's too brief, actually. Let me first explain the chart that you actually alluded to, the Italy stuff. The story is very simple here. The rise of China meant the increased global income position for most of the Chinese. So if you have like a top pole there with like from the bottom first percent of the world to the hundreds, so they went up. As they go up, of course, people who were there have to go down simply because it's an ordinal ranking. No, I'll come to that. So they globally go down. Now, you can say even if inequality within country has not changed, they will still go down. And actually, that's what we see in all rich countries, the decline of the bottom 20 to 40% in the global rank. Now, you can say, well, it doesn't matter because I don't compare myself to the Chinese. It doesn't matter. And in some sense, it doesn't matter. But there is other sense, it might matter because you actually have goods, international price goods or services that are no longer available to you. In a more simple terms, it would mean that the German metal worker and the German engineer are not going to have 1 month of vacation in Thailand because it will be too expensive for the worker. And this is actually going to transpire, and actually it is transpiring at the level of individual countries. On top of that, obviously there could be an increase, and there was an increase of inequality, which will further sort of dampen the position of the lower parts of the distribution. So that's simply the facts. Now, obviously the effect is why the domestic turmoil, I cannot prove it, but we do see quite a lot. And for the two hegemons, my argument was simply the following, is that if you were to ask people in an abstract sense, do you think it is good that actually some countries like China and India actually catch up in terms of total income with the United States or with the West? They would say, everybody, if you were to ask everybody, they would say, yes, that's actually great stuff. But it's not necessarily great stuff because we do actually have hegemonic contests. And so that was the point, is that actually you could have positive developments that we believe are positive developments which create conflict.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Nishan Dimel from Sri Lanka. I think $1 million question, as we discussed, I don't think anybody's disagreeing that equality is a value, but where do you focus to solve it? And I hear many different views on that. I just want to suggest that, a lot of times we say that the most important technology to solve is the technology of government, but in this discussion, maybe it is the technology of democratic political leadership that has actually failed us at the moment. And Amartya Sen famously says that it's not just public balloting, but public reasoning. And I want to just put for you the hypothesis that it's also public trust in that their leaders are governing in the interest of the whole. Now, if we can't solve the problem of public reasoning and public trust, having public balloting doesn't deliver us democracy. I want to leave that as a thought for you to respond to.
So the question is essentially, how do we solve the various forms of inequality we talk about? Binaifer, you want to take a stab at that?
So what we've done is we've basically shifted the way we work to actually now work more closely with governments. I think there's been a trend over the years where governmental institutions have been hollowed out in terms of their own expertise, in terms of their ability to be innovative, to lead things. And I think now in this moment of climate change, etc., you need competent government departments to be able to actually come to the table. So we are seeing that as a play. But I don't think, again, this is not a moment for binaries. There's no one silver bullet for any of this. There's going to be multiple spaces, but that's just one where we've shifted to where we think it'll be more effective.
Ravi, you had something you wanted to add. Oh, here, you have a microphone.
Yeah. On the trust issue. So it goes back, maybe not directly answering the question, Nishan, but segueing from it. It goes back to the point about the form of the distribution, form of the proposed redistribution matters. When you have a package A versus a package B, both of which lead to the same outcomes in the distribution, and somehow the population prefers A to B. Or A checks all the boxes, but it doesn't prefer it. What's going on? I think Joe has written about this in some of his, which is that the population doesn't trust that the whole package A will be put together. Whereas our analysis says, if you put the whole package A together, then you get this outcome, which is good. They just don't trust that element A1 will act. You're saying we'll do A1, then we'll do A2. Yeah, we've seen this movie before. A2 will not happen after this. So that's one type of a reason. So two examples of that, So some years ago, 15 years ago, Iran they were proposing a reduction in fuel subsidies in Iran to be compensated for by transfer. The usual classic sort of thing, checks all the boxes and so on. But of course, the population doesn't trust that you'll actually do the transfers afterward. So what they did in this particular context, was that they put money into people's bank accounts, which they could do given the structure. And the money was there. and the population could see the money was there, but it could only be accessed the day after the subsidies were removed. That's just an example of how far you have to go in order to for the population to trust that this is what you're going to do. Another point I would say, it's a work that Suresh Naidu and Kuziem Co have done here, looking at shifts amongst the Democratic Party electorate and how it's moved in a particular way that we all understand, educated versus not. So basically, the proposition is liberalize and then redistribute. Okay, and that apparently seems to be accepted by a lot of the more educated people in the thing. Okay? So they're very progressive, very redistributive. Liberalize the market, then use those funds to redistribute. But at the lower end of the education distribution, they don't trust that. Okay? Thank you very much. We'll leave the unliberalized market as it is because we don't trust that we will redistribute after the event. So I think these are the sorts of things that we need to understand why it is that all those packages we check all our boxes don't seem to check the population's boxes.
Did you have something you want to say? Oh, go ahead.
Empirically, that finding was actually original. I mean, for political scientists, they don't like when I say that, but actually Piketty had this finding that split between educated and uneducated. It's actually, and on many countries, actually, I think he had like 15 countries, empirical.
Exactly right, yeah.
Question over there.
Hi, I'm Matt Kavanaugh from Georgetown University. So I wonder, you all are sitting under a provocatively titled goal there, which is the end of neoliberalism. And perhaps Joe has given it to us as a question, or perhaps it's given it to us as a statement, or perhaps it's somewhere in between. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, because I'm looking at the kind of international system side of things that you all are talking about countries existing within. And I think what we have unquestionably seen is the decline of the international liberal order. But that's not necessarily the same thing as the decline of neoliberalism. And I'm looking, for example, that we heard earlier about the World Trade Organization fights and kind of what happened there and the strength of a lot of the kind of neoliberal institutions to hold the line. And then I'm looking at countries that are battling against debt, that are battling, looking at South Africa trying to create a national health system and being absolutely attacked by the forces of neoliberalism, arguing that privatization is the only way to go. And that's backed by the international order in certain ways. So I guess my question is, are we looking at kind of the end of neoliberalism for some countries, if you are powerful enough to be China? But China's not the only conversation, right? What do we think about kind of low and middle income countries, and to the degree to which that idea of the end of neoliberalism is universal, or is it really particularistic? Thanks.
Great question. Who's got an answer? Yes, please.
Certainly from my perspective, where I work in global health, neoliberalism still has its hold in terms of shaping the global rules that affect people's health, whether it's intellectual property rules that are wired in such a way that poor countries cannot access medicines, make them for themselves at a cheap price. The rules are still stuck, and it's hard. We fought at WTO. We formed a whole global vaccine alliance with the help of Joe and others. India and South Africa led. We didn't succeed because of a handful of countries that host the big companies, pharmaceutical companies. We didn't manage, and people died of COVID. We still have those rules working against us and so many other diseases. Taxation. I think that people like Jose Antonio and Joe and others through ICRIC and so many others fighting on reforming the global tax rules, corporate tax rules, so that countries can tax and keep their fair share and not have companies take out their profits untaxed. This has been a long debate. Finally, it is in the United Nations, a convention to establish global collaboration on corporate taxation, digital being the hardest, but still, even now in the initial stages of this discussion, key countries, the UK, the United States, are walking away, don't want to agree. So I don't have reason to believe that these rules that allow big companies and wealthy individuals not to walk away from being taxed will change so soon. So it seems to me that then the international financial architecture, the fact that the rules create a situation where there is inequity in accessing finance, terms of finance, this also, there's a huge reform being proposed, but I don't see much progress at the United Nations, even though the ambition is there. We talked about it in Seville, Financing for Development Conference. It just doesn't seem that the rules that neoliberals have created, the global rules that shape the prospects of developing countries to rise, are changing. I'm not being a prophet of doom, but I think that the opportunity could be now that the system is so shocked by the change, the policy shifts here in the United States, that progressives can come together and fight hard. But neoliberalism is alive and well, starting with my field in global health.
Very interesting. I think we got time for one more question. We got one over here, please.
Thanks. Liz Pankaj, Groundwork Collaborative. I find Suresh and Ileana and Nicholas's research very fascinating, so I'm glad you brought it up. And in effect, they found, they sort of define the other thing that you were sort of getting at earlier as pre-distribution, where in fact you do not have liberal markets. You have either government intervention or some sort of order on the front end so that the distribution is in fact distributed on the back end. And I guess it's not shocking to me that we see lower income, lower educated people prefer that because they don't trust that it will be redistributed on the back end. And in fact, you have higher education, higher income people controlling that redistribution, either through political channels or corporate ones. And I think we see something similar in the UK with the rise of Farage and in general the rise of the far right across Europe and much of the developed world. I guess I'm curious then, as we sort of democratize both our economy and our political systems, is there a way to de-link those? Do we have to go, are the only policies that can in fact fix those two problems are ones that over-regulate markets, not over, but heavily regulate markets and do that pre-distribution as opposed to this redistribution that many of us in this room have been working on for many years through the tax code or through other social spending?
Sorry, is that for Ravi specifically?
I think the whole panel, but in particular.
Yeah, so this issue of so pre-distribution, you can divide into pre-distribution A and pre-distribution B. One is altering the distribution of human capital before you get it. Secondly, altering the rules of the game of the market, and that's where having minimum wage legislation and so on and so forth. So in fact, people at the lower end of the distribution would prefer minimum wage legislation, would actually prefer tariffs, in fact, to protect their jobs. Rather than remove those and then redistribute afterwards. So I'm not so sure why we should be so concerned about market intervention in that way. So I would say let's go with it. Okay, let's go with it. I'm merely purely from an economic point of view, as somebody who works on analysis of minimum wages and so on and so forth. I actually don't see that as being hugely inefficient myself, empirically. As being hugely inefficient myself. So I don't have a problem with that. This was meant to be a sort of a riposte to those who would say, well, let's remove those and then we will redistribute afterwards. And the point is, yes, that may check our economy's boxes, but the population doesn't trust it. And actually there's a division between the population that does trust it or that doesn't trust it, because actually they control how it's going to be. So that was the point I was making.
Factoid. A factoid, which actually, it's amazing to me that it has not received much greater attention. What happened in the US in 2020 is extremely interesting. Market income inequality went up by 1.5 Gini point, which is really very big. Actually, in the world of Gini points, it's a very big. Of course, people lost jobs, others got unemployed. And so. What happened at the disposable income level? The decline, if you want really to make your liberal friends unhappy, you tell them that the largest decline in inequality in the United States in the last 50 years was under the Trump administration last year. The last year of the first administration. 1.5 Gini point down. Of course, after 2021, things went back to where they were. Why did it happen? Because of the CARES Act. And when you look actually who received the money, it goes very deeply up to the 70th percentile of US income distribution. So that shows you the power of government. But if you, for political reasons, don't want or cannot use the power of the government, of course, you go back to in 2022, 2023, exactly where you were in 2019. But I think it illustrates that if you have a political will, you can do it.
Please join me in welcoming this terrific panel. Thank you all for your great questions.
Okay, folks, we're going to get started with the last panel, but just the last panel of the first day. We've got a whole fun more day to do this tomorrow. My name's Kevin Gallagher. I direct the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. And like everyone, I want to start by congratulating IPD for 25 years of excellent work. I've had the privilege of working with them throughout the whole period, the earlier days with Jose Antonio Shari and others, and now with Martine and others. And our center is only 7 years old, and we're really trying to model ourselves on what you folks are doing. And this panel is actually about the kinds of things that IPD is doing, and that's being a think tank in the middle of the policy world. And I think that one of the great things about IPD is that they're more than just a think tank. They're also a do tank. Like folks have been saying, Winnie earlier, you're working with social movements, you're working with other governments, you're not just sitting here in academia writing all the great papers that you do, you're also pushing that out there in the real world. So it's great to sit here and celebrate that with everyone. Since no one's mentioned it yet before I start, I'm actually also officially part of the IPD. Joe, Yedinin Capaldo, and Gabriele and I edit something called the Journal of Globalization and Development, which comes out of the IPD and also the GDP Center at BU. And since there's so many academics in the room, we really want to just recruit you to submit some of your articles to the JDD. It was largely founded because we saw a real gap in the development literature. Many of the international economics journals were starting to, after the financial crisis, really just focusing on the global north again because of the crises in the north. And all the development economics journals were sort of just focusing on these micro foundations, RCTs and something like that. And we saw a real need for something in the middle. And we think we've got a great product, and go to the IPD webpage, check out our journal, and submit our articles to us. Well, let's get started with this session, which is called Successes and Failures of Think Tanks, Making Think Tanks More Effective. And we've got 4 terrific folks on this panel. I could spend the whole 2 hours talking about their incredible bios. You can look those up. I'll just tell you their affiliations. So from my left to right here, I've got Jason Bordoff. He's a local. He's the founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia University. Then we have Bruce Chapman, professor at the Australian National University. Rob Johnson, also a local in a different way. He's the president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And Miguel Soto-Clas, he's the founder and board chair of the Center for a New Economy. And so what we want to talk about is centers like the IPD. These folks are all part or have been engaged with centers like the IPD. How have they been effective? What are some of the successes and failures that they've had? And especially in this particular moment, to what extent do we need to reposition ourselves and pivot the way that we've been doing our work to try to continue to be effective. And we're going to try to make this one a little bit more of a conversation. We'll talk amongst ourselves for a little while, but get ready because we want to pull you folks in pretty close. So I'm going to start with my first question. I'm going to ask to Jason, Rob, and Miguel, because these folks have all been at the ground floor of founding think tanks that have been quite effective in many different ways. I want to ask the 3 of you folks, first of all, just to take a step back, what do you think the role of a think tank is in a society like ours? And how was yours started? And what made you personally get involved with this? And why don't we'll start with Miguel, Rob, and then Jason, and I'll do another round that goes in the other direction. Miguel.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here. I also want to congratulate Joe and Jose Antonio, Martin, the faculty, the staff, everybody at IPD on your 25th anniversary. A lot of great things, and I know it's not easy to stay around and be relevant for that long, so I think it's a great accomplishment, and I'm happy to be here today. In my case, our group has been around for a while too. I founded the Center for a New Economy in Puerto Rico back in 1998. And I had been working in government for a while. And Puerto Rico had no think tanks back then, but I had studied political science and was very aware of the think tanks here in the US and in Europe and in Latin America. And we always wondered why there wasn't one in Puerto Rico, but it wasn't until my time in government where I kind of saw how the sausage was made in terms of policy that I realized, this is just not the way to do it. It was a very partisan process. It was a very political process. I just thought, Puerto Rico needs a place where we look at what would be best for the majority of the people. Not what would be best for a particular industry or what would be best for a particular political party. And there was just no forum for that. There was no platform for that. And so we got together a group of people and founded CUNY in 1998. And I think, to answer your second question or your first question, I think that's one of the important things about think tanks. It's a platform, it's an area, it's a system, a place where you can build and develop policy, and I think the way that you should do that, which is using empirical research, thinking about what's best for the majority of people in the society where you're working at, and I think it's generally accepted that that'll give you better results. And so we've started that way, and later on I'll talk about a little bit more about how it's been going.
I want to start with a memory. Back in 1982, I was finishing my last, which we might call last passage for the master's degree to go on and finish. And I took a course called Advanced Theory, myself and two other students, and there was a teacher named Joseph Stiglitz. And Joseph Stiglitz, through that course, did something completely different than I had ever had as an undergraduate at MIT or at Princeton. He didn't come in and have us read the literature. We talked about questions and built things together. And then, and this is what I really wanted to highlight with you, when we had to pass the general exam, I came in and sat down and I opened the page and it said, well, you've been taking tests for a long time, but right now, I want you to start thinking about your future. So is the question at the center of this general exam, what are you interested in that you haven't seen that you would like to build? Start working on your next chapter of your dissertation today. Let's get a head start. And I remember grinning and looking at the other two guys, and we were all smiling. And I thought, it's the first time I've ever smiled while taking a general exam. But Joe catalyzed what you might call a playfulness and then a yearning and a method for bringing yourself and your imagination to life and doing constructive things. And I've never seen it disappear, Joe. But thank you for that beautiful starting period and all that you've done since.
The Institute for New Economic Thinking kind of came out of the fact that I had been the chief economist of both the Republican Budget Committee in the Senate and then the Senate Banking Committee during the time of the '87 stock market crash and the savings and loan bailout. When the Bear Stearns and the Lehman crisis emerged, I was working with Dodd and Frank, who were the head of the banking committees, and Nancy Pelosi and others, as the presidential election was approaching and the TARP legislation was being launched. And as we got into it, moving beyond 2008, Obama wins the election in 2009. A man named Robert Duggar, who had been chief economist of both Senate and House banking committees, and I got together and said, we aren't solving the problems. What I use, and it's a phrase I used at the time, the mother of all moral hazards was being created, where big banks were being promised that the upside was theirs to keep and the downside they would be bailed out, which meant they put way more capital at risk and they gained market share relative to smaller banks. And we didn't build anything to restrict what you might call the menu and reduce the risk once we were subsidizing them with this. And what it felt like to me, and it felt like to Rob Duggar and a couple of other people we consulted, was that we were setting up the danger of an unstable financial system in the future. And I got together with George Soros about writing. I had been a member of the Soros Fund Management in years previously, and I got together with George, who I met during the '87 stock market crash when he came down to talk to me about what hearings to build. And George and I wrote a piece for the Financial Times. And then we went out to dinner with Rob Duggar and said, I think we need to found a think tank about this and really take this on. And while over time we moved away from just the financial sector to many other things related to African development, Asian development, and others, that was the, what you might call, traumatic birth experience of INET. And I think the, how would I say, the sense that I had is why I joined is I felt like I had experience both in private sector and in governance, and we had a very dangerous and fragile situation that wasn't being addressed correctly. And I felt like there were many good spirits, like Joe Stiglitz, George Akerlof, Jim Heckman, and others, who were prestigious economists, many Nobel laureates. I think there were 5 or 7 altogether that worked with us. And to take on, what you might call the simple mathematical rational expectations, the market takes care of itself mindset, and bring us back to what you might call the fragileness and the dangers that surrounded the actual financial market in which we all were embedded as members of the society and economy.
So thanks for the invitation to be here, and congratulations to IPD and to Joe. I'm really grateful to be part of this panel. For those, I'll just expand on the introduction a little bit by way of telling you, answering the question. So I'm Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor of practice here at the School of International Public Affairs, and run the, as you heard, the Center on Global Energy Policy. That, I guess the best way to think about that is an energy policy think tank inside Columbia University. About 100 people, about a $20 million a year budget, and that is not including all of the extraordinary tenured faculty that you find across a university like Columbia as a way to organize them. But one of the things we did in building it was build a team of research scholars, senior fellow types, who might not be hired into tenure track faculty positions at the university, but have deep expertise, have worked in government, maybe have worked in the private sector, worked at places like the International Energy Agency, and they come here to do what one might think of as more think tank scholarship. And it also is, so I think that's slightly, I don't know if that's unique. I mean, it's a little different because many university institutes and centers are ways to organize the activities of the latter faculty, of the tenure faculty. I think doing that, but also building your own team of researchers was something we felt was really important in order to achieve the mission I'll talk more about, which is providing timely policy relevant analysis and producing knowledge in sort of formats that decision makers in policy roles or others sort of need. And so my own background is kind of making energy policy or trying to help people make energy policy. When I was young, worked in the Clinton administration's Treasury Department with people who I guess were the champions of neoliberalism, like Bob and Larry, and then went to the Brookings Institution for 5 years, and then I spent 4 years as the energy advisor to President Obama in the National Security Council, so sort of come at issues of energy and climate through a foreign policy and national security lens, and then left after his first term to create what is now the Center on Global Energy Policy. And the idea sort of came to me, and many of you who served in government, this I think might resonate. You know the time pressures that people are under, the enormous complexity of the issues that you're dealing with. When we came into the White House, people were first hearing about a thing called the shale revolution. And it was like, what is that? How transformative is that going to be? And what is it going to mean for the environment, for economic activity in the U.S., for our geopolitical position in the world, that the U.S. might become a much bigger energy producer all of a sudden. And when you're in those roles, you're trying to understand those things, you have really short time frames to do it. You don't always have the expertise you need within government, although there's extraordinary expertise in government. And you're bombarded by information, but most of it's advocacy information, right? Like NGOs are going to send you a report, industry groups are going to send you a report. Sometimes the reports are good, but there's an agenda, and you know there's an agenda, and you read it through that lens. And what you need is independent, rigorous analysis you can trust. In a field like energy, it really has to be cross-cutting. Shale is a good example. Hugely important environmental issue, hugely important economic issue, hugely important foreign policy issue. And you kind of need to think about it through all of those lenses to make good policy decisions and consider the possibility of potential trade-offs. And universities, of course, are extraordinary in their rigor, their independence, their expertise, their trust. Talk about what's happening in the world today, but their trust in society. I think what I found as a policymaker was that too often what they failed to do was to take that expertise and that knowledge and make it available to people outside of the academy in the formats and timeframes that decision makers in the real world need. So what I was interested in doing was trying to solve that problem, and then I think speaks to your question about the role of think tanks and why they're needed. What I saw at there are a lot of think tanks in the world, and a lot of them are not that rigorous or that high quality in my view, but there are some that are. And I think I don't paint with a broad brush. The people in this room are more the exception to this, but painting with a broad brush, to be unfair for a moment, the need for think tanks stems in part from the fact that universities, broadly speaking, generally, too often, have taken themselves out of the game of producing deeply rigorous analysis that is useful to decision makers outside of academia. Too often, the focus is sort of on arcane methodological, theoretical debates within a particular academic discipline, and knowledge is produced in places that are less accessible to people who are not trained in that discipline. The jargon that is used, the currency of it, the ways that people are promoted, makes it difficult for that knowledge to help people who are trying to use that knowledge to make better policy decisions. And then on the other side, you have lots of groups, some call themselves think tanks, some don't, but really their mission is advocacy. They have an agenda, they have a predetermined sort of conclusion before they ask the question. And then the idea is, how do you produce analysis to back up a position, because you're kind of in one camp or the other, and we see a lot of that in Washington, more and more. You're in an ideological camp, and you have to defend a certain administration and criticize a certain administration and build some data basis, some analytic basis to do that. But that's really not what I think good decision making needs. And we can come to the moment we're in now, because one of the challenges for think tanks is you need a receptive audience to expertise in a policy community in order for the work you're doing to be useful. And I think whether that is true today is something we can come back to and talk about. But I do think this is a moment, and probably true in a lot of areas, like the end of neoliberalism and what comes next, certainly true in energy, where for all the progress we've made in clean energy, oil use, gas use, coal use are still going up every year. Emissions are going up. We're not making a ton of progress. And I say that because this feels like a moment. It's always the case, but it just, to me, it feels even more so. We're like, new ideas are needed. We need new approaches. We need we need innovation in policy. We need new solutions and new ideas. We can't keep showing up every year in Baku and getting 200 nations in a room and debating until 3 in the morning whether to give $300 billion or $1 trillion to poor countries when every country is at a level of historic debt we haven't seen since World War II and nobody has the money to do these things anyway. We need like new ways of doing things. And I think we also need people who can respond quickly to debates and provide analysis. If this administration says wind and solar are a problem because they are intermittent and they destroy the reliability of the grid, like who can you trust to provide some analysis about that? They should be sources of talent, feeding potential people to serve in government over time. And there's an educational mission. Obviously, within a university, that's true for a student body, but much more broadly within society, being trusted experts to talk to the media and to help people understand complex issues. And the last thing I'll say is, after spending 5 years at Brookings, when I was thinking about where to do something like this coming out of government, the idea of doing it inside a university was so deeply appealing because just the breadth of expertise that exists inside a research university, right? I mean, we have 100 scholars, or we have 700 people, 70 or so scholars. That is fantastic, but like whatever topic you want to work on, how do we think about supply chain security for batteries with China, the future of oil demand? You might want to know whether there are going to be breakthroughs in battery chemistry that are going to change how much lithium the world needs in the future, because we don't know they're coming. We have like 50 people in the engineering department doing nothing but studying that every day. Same with law, same with finance, same with our climate school. And so the ability to tap into that knowledge, as great a think tank as a place like Brookings or many others are, there's really few institutions in society that have that kind of breadth that you can tap into. And the challenge is how to engage all of them in that sort of more spending their time doing something that may be different from what traditional academia is about. And the last thing I'll say is the reason when I was thinking about where to go do that, what university, and I spoke to a few, chose Columbia because it was a place where I felt like coming in as a professor of practice, you would be welcomed as a peer. And that is not necessarily the case everywhere. And I just want to say nobody made me feel that way more than Joe Stiglitz. Coming in, not having a traditional academic track, but coming in to do policy-relevant scholarship here, and how supportive you've been, Joe, of what we built at the Energy Center has really meant a lot. So I just want to say thank you.
Thanks, Jason. That's a perfect segue to talking to Bruce, because we think tanks can ask ourselves, pat ourselves on the back, but you've been a producer and a consumer of think tank information, and Bruce has also been a policymaker himself and a consumer of it, but has also been in the middle of things. Bruce, a particular question for you. What can think tanks and others interested in influencing policy learn from some of your successes? So obviously you have to share some of your successes first.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Jared, for inviting me on. I've never been in a think tank. I don't necessarily think I think that well for a think tank. But I was involved in a policy reform in Australia in 1989, which hadn't been done before and was not in the textbooks. And there was great scepticism that it would work. And I don't know if there's a secret as to how you influence policy, but there are certainly some lessons for that experience. So Australia at the time was a country without university tuition. And that was true of other countries institutionally very similar to Australia, New Zealand, for example, and England and Wales. And the government at the time wanted to introduce tuition. And when the minister met me, he said, your job is to come up with tuition that is going from zero to some large sum of money, or not that large, it was about a quarter of the overall cost. And it's got to be a way that encourages poor people to come. And I said, so you would like me to design an upward sloping demand curve? Is that the challenge here? The higher the price, the more people want to come. He said, yeah, you can do it. I didn't think I could do it. But, so I went away for 3 months and I looked at bank loans situations. And of course, we all know through Milton Friedman's work there's a major capital market failure when it comes to investment in human capital. Students don't have collateral. banks wouldn't get involved because of the default cost to them. So you have to have bank loans. And in every country that I looked at, there was only one form of bank loan, which is like your mortgage. You pay a certain amount every month for a set time period, maybe 10 years. Doesn't matter what your situation is. Doesn't matter if you didn't graduate from college. It doesn't matter if you're working part-time or looking after an infant. You have an obligation which is time contingent. And I thought that the only way you could actually not discourage poor people was to take away the risk of having trouble repaying a loan. And the only way you can take away the risk is to have it paid when you can pay it. It's as simple as that. So pay when you can was essentially the system. So I didn't really know what I was doing. Sometimes I think I still don't really know what I was doing, but it wasn't in the textbooks and it had to be made up. So I wrote an options paper for him, and I had a very bizarre him. I think he was very confused about this meeting because he could tell, if you've ever written an options paper, you write it in a way that looks very balanced, but you want whoever's going to implement it to go a particular direction. We all know that. And he read the paper and he said, I can see where you're coming from. I have to ask you a few questions. He said, so it says pay when you can, so it's paid later. He said, how do you know this will work? And I said, I don't. And he said, well, how many other countries do it like this? And I said, well, none. None that I'm aware of, which made it look as if I didn't know. And there were many countries I didn't know about, but there wasn't a scheme like this. He said, well, what would the students think about this? I said, oh, they will hate it, because at the moment they don't pay anything. So it doesn't matter that it's got good characteristics in terms of economics, like insurance against default or capacity to pay being the bottom line. And then the big question for him was, his political problem was he needed a lot of money to make the system big. There were queues mounting up. It's all public universities, so the number of places is always going to be determined by government outlays. It was a Labor government, but it was kind of a middle-of-the-road Labor government. They did not want to increase taxes. He had to have a source of revenue, and that source of revenue was seen to be equitable, coming from graduates because of the income, the regressive nature of so-called free education. So when he asked me these questions, like, does it exist, will it work, are you confident about it? And my answer was no, no, no. And what will the students think? Well, I'll hate it. When do we get the money? I said, well, if you started in a year, now remember the repayment depends on income, so we want to make the first income threshold quite high, and so the graduates have to graduate. That'll take 4 years, and then it'll take 3 or 4 years before they hit that threshold. So the money is coming in about 7 years. Well, governments in Australia have elections about every 2.5 years. So the idea that getting the money trickling in 7 years to solve a contemporary problem sounded completely idiotic. When I thought about that conversation, I thought he probably thought that this was the worst bit of public policy he'd ever seen. We don't know if it worked, there's no precedent, we don't know what we're doing, no, it's not done anywhere, everybody will hate it and you don't get any money. So pass me the Nobel Prize, please. So here's the big question, and this was the big lesson for the whole thing for me. Why did he do this anyway? And the answer was the political kickback from his party. His party was a Labor Party, a Democrat Party, and the great icon of the Australian Labor Party was a Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. With great fanfare, he abolished university fees in 1974. So it was seen to be absolutely a right, and people use that term all the time. Free education, free higher education is a right, not a privilege. And how dare you, as a Labor government, go against the great icon, Gough Whitlam, who abolished fees. And so he needed a scheme that was so benign in appearance and one that he could sell to his parliamentary colleagues who were quite resentful and hostile about it. So if we had have done what I think would have happened without that political imperative, we would have copied the US. We would have had means-tested bank loans with default insurance provided by government. It wasn't just the US, it was Canada, it was all through Asia, through Latin America. But he had a political fight. So in the end, he's got a system which he says, you don't have to pay on enrolment. So no Australian college student has to find any money when they enrol. You only pay in periods where you're earning above the average income. And remember, it's the average taxpayers who are financing all this to the privileged, basically to the privileged people who are graduates. If you can't afford to, it's irrelevant. If you don't pay the whole of your life, it doesn't matter. If you have periods of bad luck or unemployment or illness or looking after a baby, it's all irrelevant. They'll get the money later. So, and then he was very cunning. He said, and we're going to use all the money for one thing only, and that is to make the university system bigger and better. So that is a package that's very hard to argue against. It was progressive, it offered default insurance, it offered insurance against repayment hardship, and all the money was going to be used on the students. By the way, I didn't understand most of this at the time. I just thought it seemed pretty fair. That seemed a pretty fair way to go. And I was aware that defaults were a nasty bit of work, but that was it. So that's kind of why he did that. And I was very interested to talk to my close friend, Richard Dennis, who I thought and hoped would be at the conference. And he's the head of an Australian think tank called the Australian Institute. So I had lunch with him and said, what influences policy? And I'll tell you what doesn't influence policy from my experience, because people have said to me, oh, you must have worked all this out. You must have worked out the theory and done the modelling and done the econometrics and understood default insurance and consumption smoothing. You must have been thinking about this for years. That is not the way it happened. I had no idea until he insisted that we come up with this. And I said to Richard, I know what it's not. It is not having a great idea. Hello, here's climate change coming up. Let's have a carbon tax and emissions trading system minister. That's what we need. No, they need to be convinced that you're going to solve their problem. His problem was his own party. His problem was not the students. He didn't seem to care about that. His own party was against it. So he had to come up with something soft and cuddly. It was a little pussycat. It was so benign you couldn't get into any trouble. So that was kind of the motivation for it. And this system has now been adopted in other countries. It was very, very straightforward in countries which were institutionally like ours. New Zealand, the UK, for example. And they had the same problem. They weren't charging fees. They wanted the money. They wanted their systems to be bigger. And they didn't have private universities. They didn't have bank loans. They'd never thought about bank loans. That was fairly straightforward, and that happened in about the first 10 years. But that's the first lesson, really. You've got to address the problem that the policymaker wants sorted out. The second point I'll make about all this, there are enemies to policy change, and they're everywhere. And I saw them most up front and with most difficulty in the Australian Tax Office. So it's the Internal Revenue Service. And when I first went to them, I went to say, it was just my job basically. I said, we've got this new scheme, it's really, really progressive, it's going to help a lot of people, help a lot of poor people, but it has to be collected through the tax system because that's efficient. And the guy looked at me and he just said, no. And I said, what do you mean? No, he said, read my lips, Sonny. He didn't say Sonny, but he meant Sonny. We collect taxes, we don't collect debt. Off you go. And I was so discouraged, I thought, that's ridiculous. Why can't they collect debt? You've got to have it contingent on income. They know what the income is. So every time I went back, there was a new problem. People die. One guy said, well, you think this will make more people die? Okay, I don't think he thought it would. People leave the country. I said, would you leave the country if it saved you $10 a week? And then one startling morning, this is going on for months, he said, and what about women? Have you ever thought about women? And I thought, well, I hardly know you. Do I really want this conversation? He said, I'll tell you something about women. And I said, oh, can I take notes? So he then said, this is what will happen under this scheme. The women will all have a lot of babies, and they'll all marry a brain surgeon in the richest part of Sydney, and when their children have left the nest, they'll all enrol for university education. They never have to pay up front, it's all paid later. They'll all get scot-free. This is a terrible scheme that'll cost too much money. Well, what's the answer to that? And this is a really important point. The answer is in the data. If people make assertions, which they do all the time, go check it out. And when I looked at the age earnings profiles and even the distributions of female graduates, it wasn't an issue. They were going to repay in the main in the first 8 years, and that actually turned out to be the case. So you come up with the data. The other piece of data, the other lesson I learned was, don't use fancy hieroglyphic economic jargon. If you get the minister saying, you know why we want to do this? The internal rate of return to our university education is 9.9% per annum real. That doesn't mean anything to anybody. How about we say the average graduate earns $1.5 million more over their lifetime than the average non-graduate? Makes sense, it's easier to understand, and they're important lessons of communication. I'll just, two more minutes, is that okay?
No, I'm going to cut you off now, but we'll get back to you. I want to make sure everyone else gets a chance to share some things too, because you just shared an incredible success story. I just want just like very 1 or 2 sentence answers to the next 2 questions, and then we'll really get into the why and what led to the answers that you give me to your next 2 questions. And we'll start with Jason this time and go that way. And this will be for the three folks who are in think tanks. Quickly start, just say, what are 2 or 3 of your biggest successes? Just as a matter of fact, go around. And then I'm going to do the second quick round. What are 2 or 3 of your biggest failures? And then we'll have a larger conversation of what were the elements of success and failure. So just start now with a couple quick successes as a think tank category.
Yeah, I guess I'll answer it with 2 sentences first, which is we spend a lot of time thinking about how to define impact, and it is appropriately and should be a very hard thing to do. So that should be actually a quite hard question to answer. It is very rare that there is a piece of legislation and you're like, we made that happen. But the question is, when there's a big debate, are you kind of feeding an idea into a small part of it? Did it change the way someone thought about something? Are you like in that bloodstream that kind of goes from idea to execution, and at what point you're in it? So I can think of specific cases like that. There was a big debate about permitting reform and the Manchin-Barrasso bill in DC, 18 months, 2 years ago, and there was a particular piece of it that some, in this case, although we try to work on both sides of the aisle and be nonpartisan, some Democratic senators were concerned about, and getting some pushback from some people on kind of what you would call the left, I guess, and it related to sort of activities in the oil and gas sector. And they reached out, and some of their staff and the members themselves, and said, we know that you care deeply about climate change, broadly speaking as an institution. We know you understand all parts of energy, clean energy, and also the 80% of the energy that's still hydrocarbons around the world. And can you kind of help us just do an analysis to understand this so we know what's right, on this issue? I thought that was a success, because in the end, the memos we wrote, the briefings we did inform the way they thought about it and help them get to, I think, a good place, informed by some data there. But the phone call was like what I was most proud of. That it was like, we're bombarded by advocacy information, is what I said a moment ago. And we just kind of need to know what's true and what's right about what this group is saying or this group is saying, and we trust you. And can you put some people on this to help us? And we were then able to respond, which is my other point about whether academics can do that. Can you drop the NSF grant you have that you've been working on for 3 years and say, you know what, for the next 3 weeks, we're going to come together as a team and we're going to work on this because a few senators have asked for our help. That comes to my other point about building a team of sort of practice-oriented scholars, in addition to then being able to work with the tenure track ladder faculty across the university. Both of those things are less common than they should be.
Success of INET.
I think one thing that we did very assertively is to try to understand and get very high-level economist research what wasn't a proper incentive related to tenure in peer-reviewed journals. And people like Angus Deaton, I've heard his name a couple times today, and others looked at the history of what's been produced in the 3- and 5-star journals, what gets you tenure, what gets you government grants, and so forth. And we could see that what you might call systematic avoidance from things that what you might say have plutocratic danger. And so seeing that from the standpoint of people who will become economists, we founded something called the Young Scholars Initiative, which to this day has approximately 28,000 members. And we started to teach them what does it look like to become an assistant professor, to have to go forward, to have to navigate through where these journals are. People like James Heckman at University of Chicago was very vivid in lecturing. George Akerlof was very vivid in lecturing to these young people about what was the obstacle course to success, and do you want to do this with your life? And then the young people started to come back to us saying, we should make grants to people who will write the real stuff and create the equivalent of a library, whether it's video or written papers or books, that they can use as their curriculum rather than the, what I'll call sanitized basic economic textbooks. And I think that that process worked well, and I want to be a little bit careful here, because I didn't try to do this to shame or slam people. When I was young, I had a very intense experience when Martin Luther King came to my community. And I won't go into it, but somebody attacked my mother for voting to let him speak at a school. I studied his writings as my minor in college. And one of the things I always talk to the INET staff about is when you disagree with people, you want to engage them. But Dr. King used to say, hate can't drive out hate. Only love can do that. And darkness can't drive out darkness. Only light can do that. So I tried many times to engage the people who were parts of the resistance, but drawing them in, asking for their perspective, rather than trying to shame them or run around them. And I think that that process had worked very well for INET, for the young scholars. The second thing that I take a lot of pride in is the amount of work that we did in building relationships in Asia. Early on in INET, because I knew his wife from years ago, when I was at MIT, I came from Detroit and I worked with a woman named Rothschild on a book about what happened to the auto industry. Years later, she married Amartya Sen, and he used to take me every year in December and January to India and explore. Similarly, in a different channel, we had very good relationships with the Chinese Academy of Social Science, Tsinghua University, Beida University, and we really dove into exploring and learning in China and worked with Jack Ma's Luhan Academy and so forth, and got to the point where the famous scholar Michael Sandel wrote a book while he was on a sabbatical with us called What Money Can't Buy, Morals and Markets. And I am told that over 50 million people in China took that course. And I felt very proud in the sense that it was not an easy thing to reduce the fear of the Chinese government of what we were doing. but by working proactively and connecting with the foreign ministry. I never did a meeting without asking them beforehand for permission. We built trust, and we built, how would I say, events and meetings all over the Chinese country in many different places. And so I would put those as the plus column that I was most proud of.
Thanks, Rob. When we get to failures in the future, I want to flag that both you and Jason have both emphasized the key for think tanks to be trusted. And I'm just flagging that for now. We'll get there. Miguel, share some successes of your think tank.
Yeah, sure. So we had some signature policies that we were able to get passed that were very important for Puerto Rico on the energy sector. I'm particularly proud that we were able to include Puerto Rico into the federal earned income tax credit, which Puerto Rico had never been a part of. It took us 15 years to get that done. Policy takes time, but it's helped 650,000 families every year since then. It's bringing in, from the federal government, about $800 million a year, about another $400 million a year from the local government, which is going to these families, it's going to the economy. So we've had successes, but particularly interested in the topic of the failures, and you know, we've had many of those, in part because
Why there's failures, we're gonna get to.
Well, I haven't had a chance to talk, and I wanted to say some things. I mean, I think you have to break the rules sometimes because I think we're running out of time, and I'm the only one following the rules. So let me say a couple. We got another hour. All right. Anyway, let me say this point about the failures, because I do think they're very important. You know, some of them are unforced errors, right? You know, they're a failure of our own imaginations. Others are because we don't have the funding and the capacity that we've needed at the time to do some of these things. But I'm particularly afraid now of what's happening in this environment, because, you know, we've talked about influence and what it takes to change policy, but the question for me now is influencing who? You know, for a long time, when we were coming up, you influenced government. But now we're in a situation where government is very different from what it used to be. You know, you and I were talking about, you know, how it was back in the day and how much partisanship there was, but how much you could get across. That doesn't exist anymore. So who is it that we're trying to influence now? And, you know, there's so much distrust in terms of expertise, too, you know. And so I think, and this is why I mentioned the failures, you know, are we walking into more, if we keep doing things the way that we've done them in the past, are we going to fall into more of these failures of imagination and real failures? And I'll just end with this quick anecdote. I'm sure some of you will know this, and this happened actually in the Biden administration, not in the Trump administration. The second tranche of the PPPs that were handed out, it has a long list at the end. You know, it's a form you fill out. There's this long list at the end. It says, you know, have you ever been accused of being a terrorist? Have you ever worked for a foreign government? It has all these things there that you usually just say, no. You know, have you ever been in jail? There was one, it was like the 9th one, it said, does your organization describe itself as a think tank? And if you put yes, you couldn't apply for that second tranche of the PPP. This was under the Biden administration, not under the Trump administration. Now under this administration, we have a whole new series of threats. You know, we've already seen they literally keep Excel spreadsheets of who says what. You know, they use artificial intelligence to go through the 990s to see, you know, who's doing what. So you know, again, speaking of the failures, I think, and influence and who to influence, I think we're in a completely different atmosphere now. This is a completely different ecosystem for think tanks. And what's worked or hasn't worked in the past is not necessarily going to work anymore.
Let me just add a little bit of fun there. About a week ago, I got a call from a guy who I used to mentor. He was my successor as chief economist at the banking committee. And he said, remember you used to talk about bipartisanship? And he said, and then I told you after Newt Gingrich came to town, I couldn't play softball with Republicans on the weekends because I would be fired. He said, I'm calling you back because now that Trump is president, I don't know what anybody can do with anybody anymore. There's no social life and everybody's just hiding. So, how to say, emphasizes exactly what you're saying. The disorientation and fear right now in policy is troubling.
I used to work for Congress. I used to work for Chester Atkins, who used to go by the name of Chet Atkins. He does go by the name of Chet Atkins. And I said that our greatest accomplishment was, my greatest accomplishment as a staff member for him was naming our softball team that we used to play the Republicans. Chet Atkins' greatest hits. You need to know American country music to know what that means. But you know, as a director of a think tank as well, we just had a retreat about this, of what are some of our successes. And like Jason said, I don't think any of us would ever say that one thing that any of us have ever done is had a major change in policy. We're all doing this as part of larger groups. But some of the things that we've done in the past couple of years is that we modeled what the potential liabilities would be from European countries if they did green transitions and how they'd be liable for what are called investor-state disputes under the Energy Charter Treaty. And that was part of a larger campaign. But now, on climate change grounds, country after country in Europe has withdrawn from the Energy Charter Treaty, played a role in that. We also worked with, what was so great was working with IPD and SIPA and others on the IMF surcharges. And we did this modeling after the financial crisis. The multilateral development banks have been extra conservative in their lending because of Dodd-Frank and the way that the credit agencies have worked. And we did this modeling that showed that they could lend a lot more money and still wouldn't jeopardize their credit ratings. And now, because of that and some other people and a whole commission that was created out of that, they're now committing to lending $357 billion more than they were. And we've also done some work that played a role in China banning financing coal overseas and shifting to clean energy. Bruce, let me go to you here. So my last, I'm only going to ask two more questions and then open it up to you folks. Let's be quick in these answers. So we all talk about our successes. And Bruce, we heard about your success. But for each of you now, very quickly, talk about a failure. And then my last question is going to be, well, what determines success and failure? And we'll bring it out here. But just quickly, share a failure that you've been engaged with. And let's be honest. And yes, this is being live streamed. And so I hope our funders out there know that we're being honest here, but we're going to learn from our failures and never do it again.
There's not enough time for me to tell you about the failures. There was like one success, and Joe helped with all this. We had a conference in Thailand, which was more or less designed around the idea of trying to understand income contingent loans like 25 years after they'd started. So I think we called this, well, it works in practice, but would it work in theory? And Joe helped hugely with that. You can take income contingent policy instruments and plunk them into many spaces. Extensions of paid parental leave, for example, for the payment of low-level criminal fines, for example, to help finance childcare, to help in the collection of brain drain reparations. We've done maybe 15 different papers for very many things. I started doing this area after we did the student loans in drought relief. And in Australia, that's a really big deal. And the farmers were getting billions of dollars worth of grants. But 5 years later, they were doing just great. Now in Paris, and they bought another portion, upgraded the harvester. So why couldn't that be a revenue contingent loan Why don't we get it? We worked out how to collect it. We talked to rural accountants. We talked to the tax people. This was really straightforward. No political party would go near it. And the reason was that the political parties wanted to be able to say, we're helping the farmers. So we're helping the farmers by giving them a lot of money. And if you come up with a system of contingent debt, you don't need government grants. It basically saves a lot of money, and it takes away the political capital of the government or some of the other political parties involved in the nature of drought relief because of the sympathy for farmers. And as economists, we had no way of dealing with that. And there have been many other applications, but I think it's really, really important to start, when you're thinking about policy change, what Richard said, what is the biggest problem for the minister or whatever, to what is going on institutionally. That's really important to see how it works or doesn't work. And 3, what's the politics that's beyond us? Nobody taught me anything about public sector administration, but it's hugely important, or about the role of and the power of politics and the power of simplicity. They're all lessons that were learned on the job. But there were many other applications that didn't go anywhere because they were either too new or too strange, or they upset the status quo. Change is hard. There's a whole lot of people out there and a whole lot of institutions that don't want change. It doesn't matter if you can say and prove, establish this will make the world better and fairer, more progressive and working better. That's not enough. There are a lot of people who don't want the change, and it's in their interest to stop it. And I've seen it many times.
To hint at this, Miguel, but share a failure of your tank.
Yeah, I think something specific. Puerto Rico underwent a huge municipal bankruptcy several years back, and a control board, a finance control board, was imposed over the territory. And we fought hard against that. We thought that a regime of fiscal rules would have been better, but we were unable to get that passed. And it's an example again of the asymmetry. There were very huge interests with a lot of money that were pushing on the other side. We were a very small group with very limited resources, and sometimes it comes down to that. So that's a failure I've always felt on the policy side. There's a second one that I feel is maybe even more important, and that is our inability of growing more. And so, I think for most of the folks up here, you guys are part of universities. We had that opportunity when we started, and I decided that I would rather have it be completely independent. And so we've never taken money from government, and we're a completely independent institution. But that then has made it very difficult for us to survive over time. So, we started in '98. We've been around for a while. I think we've been very fortunate, but we've never kind of been able to kind of break that budget of $5 to $10 million a year and to continue to grow. We've maintained very small, and it's very difficult for NGOs. We don't have a capital market like private companies have in order to they can have equity or debt and things like that. We're very reliant on contributions basically, and sometimes you can open income streams to consulting or things like that, but then your independence starts to be questioned. So that inability to make our group more durable, bigger, stronger, which is I think what we're going to need in this environment, a group that can withstand. I mean, look at the universities, look at the law firms, how they have reacted to what's happening and to the loss of money. You can imagine what a small institution with a less than $5 million a year budget, what can happen to them. So I see that as a failure as well, the inability to have grown it to a place of strength.
You already said failure? No, go.
I look at the discomfort that I have related to my own origins. My father was an All-American swimmer at the University of Michigan. He and I are both Aquarius. I've spent my whole life sailing, and I haven't done work related to water and the oceans as part of the climate change dimension like I wish I had. And I'm getting started now, working with Peter Neal, who runs the World Ocean Observatory. He used to run the South Street Seaport Museum, and I was on his board, but I didn't pick up the ball in 2018 and 2019, and I regret that tremendously. The second thing, which, added to my grin in the audience today, was that I grew up in Detroit, and I watched automation, machine learning, NAFTA, and the feeling in Detroit. My parents had friends who became alcoholics, some who committed suicide. The feeling in Detroit was that the United States of America had divorced the city of Detroit. And what I have felt in light of the current outcome of the presidential election is there is a dilemma. Democratic senators, congressmen, and so forth do need to raise money. So becoming self-righteously spiritual and not paying attention to the necessary amount of money, I understand. But to be silent and not brief them or let them know or work about all of the transformational changes, the kind of things in the earlier panels today we explored, I felt like I could have made a better contribution, or INET could have made a better contribution to illuminating what progressive politicians had to do so that Donald Trump didn't get the system's broken and nobody's fixing it, join me. If we'd all been pressing harder to fix it, and Kamala Harris is a friend of mine, I've known her for many years, and to feel in the state of Michigan, where I worked during the presidential election, how quiet her administration was about where the gaps were, what did we need to build. I felt like I had been too quiet, INET had been too quiet, and we were now paying the price.
Three things quickly. One is, I think, your first question, like your ability to have cool successes, only comes from a willingness to celebrate failure. And so we have a bunch of things I'm really proud of. We've done like the largest program to train energy journalists because if they're smarter, you have a multiplier effect on the public's understanding. A big Women in Energy Leadership program, one of the most listened to energy podcasts. These were just things we tried because we were like, let's try 10 really kind of cool sounding things. And if 7 of them fail, but 2 or 3 take off, we may have done something really interesting. And if you're thinking about it in that way, I think like that allows you to do some innovative things. So I love failure when it's smart and calculated and doesn't put the whole institution at risk. I described earlier what excited me about coming to a research university as opposed to going back to even a great think tank like Brookings or something, and it was the ability to integrate within such a broad research community and take advantage of the depth of expertise you have in all of these schools. And I think if I were to identify the thing we have succeeded least well at, it is that. The idea that the think tank is too much an entity unto itself. And it has been more difficult than I appreciated to really build deep ties so that hypothetically, if we like picked up and had an office space in Midtown next to CFR tomorrow and we're no longer at Columbia, what would be different about what we do every day? And the answer to that should be much larger than it is today. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and we can talk about it, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about that and talking to faculty like Joe about it. And then the last thing is when I think about failures, you're always making strategic choices about where to deploy resources, what to prioritize, and a lot of that comes from thinking about what's coming around the corner. And in many cases, we've gotten that right, but sometimes we haven't, and we've been caught flat-footed, and then you have to build a team quickly, or you're like, I didn't see that issue coming. And of course, now we spend a lot of time thinking not just about the issues we should be prioritizing, but what does the coming age of artificial intelligence mean for the think tank function in the first place? And how does it change the nature of the work you do every day? So that is like a really big question that, you know, like a lot is at stake to get that right. And so I think those are some of the mistakes when you don't see what's coming around the corner.
Procedurally, I'd have to agree with what you said. We're also a research center at a university, and we've got 30 affiliated faculty. You said something earlier. Sometimes it's culturally or procedurally just hard for somebody to drop that NSF grant to go testify. And some disciplines and some economists just feel like that's not their role anyway. And even though they might be the expert on it, sometimes it's hard to help see them bridge that gap. I think one of the things that our center has failed at, that I think all of us who worked on trade policy have failed at, is coming up with a good alternative of what a good trade bill looks like. We can all pat ourselves on the back that we've stopped a bunch of bad trade deals, and that from economic theory, I mean, to me, the best people who've articulated the problem are Joe, Jagdish, and Danny. And for different reasons, all three of them have real fundamental problems with the kinds of trade deals that we've had. And we've been able to stop, thanks to a lot of the hardcore work that folks like Lori Wallach, who's here, have been able to play a role in stopping these things. But we need to be trading. We've heard that all day. It's different emphases for different countries. But the think tank community, it should be our job to have a Project 2025 of what real trade integration should look like. And we haven't been able to put that together. I have a couple more questions, but I feel like we've been talking at you folks for a long time. So I'm going to bring all of you in. We're going to do something a little differently this time. I'm going to take a cluster of 4 and then let you folks take them, and then we'll see how many rounds of that we can get through. I know we've started to get to know each other pretty well, but don't forget to just introduce yourself so we can start to get to know each other more. I see 2 up, but this is a mantle here, which we don't like. So I want to see some women raise their hands so we just it doesn't become a full-on mantle. There we go. So I'm going to go with a woman first, if you don't mind.
Thank you. I'm Leanne from the Australia Institute in Canberra. And my question is, that unless I've missed it completely, I can't find a global network for progressive think tanks, whereas the Conservatives have got a couple. And I wonder if there's something structurally wrong with us progressives or intellectually that we can't manage to do that, and you think that we should be. Thanks.
Thanks. My name is Enrique Ochoa. I am Mexican, a former congressman and secretary of the Energy Commission. Question for everybody. What do you recommend to get enough funding without losing independence? How do you retain your best people? And how are you using new media to connect better with larger audiences?
Yeah, thank you very much. Matthias Videos from FES, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Now, in the previous panel, we could really see how much our understanding of inequality has increased. We have the data, we have the knowledge about the effects of inequality, we have knowledge about what instruments would work. This is all there, but what is not there are any political actors that are serious in putting redistributional policies in the center of their political campaigns. And this mismatch, I wonder if this mismatch is due to the fact that think tanks, and it's the same with trade policies and climate policies, that progressive think tanks are pretty rich in producing knowledge, but they're actually very poor in their political capabilities. So my question is, if we are not at the moment in a political situation where think tanks need to be more strategic in the sense that they try to cultivate a bit of an ecosystem where they translate or where they connect their knowledge to building political narratives, building political alliances in a smarter way, and also to transform knowledge into ideas that can be used for political campaigning.
Hi everyone, Marina from Boston University again. I'm just helping the gender balance a bit. So, very interesting panel. I just want to ask you folks, you have staff that work with you, other researchers and other staff in the university. So what do you say to those in your network
how can these people, maximize their impact when they do research? I was talking with Joe yesterday that this may be an embedded autonomy. When you do research, we need to be very close to policymakers, but we also need to have independence and innovation. So what do you say for research or people in their network? How can you do it better? Thank you.
Wanted to answer every one of those questions, but why don't we start with Miguel? Pick one, and we'll come down the line. And the quicker we answer, the more rounds we can do.
Yeah. So I'll say this and agree with several of the things that have been said in terms of the lack of the networks. Completely agree with that. It's part of the problem we have now. Of course, now there's all these other think tanks, which are really, there's no there, but they connect to the Atlas network, and then they say, oh yeah, we're a think tank, and it's, basically one person with the bullet points of that group. So that is a huge issue, as we talk about influence. The panel earlier today talked about how captured our democracy is. And it used to be that think tanks were these great engines of influence. But again, who are we influencing now? And to the question of, how can we get that research out? One thing we've done is we try to influence public opinion and let public opinion kind of be that strong arm that can then move policymakers when we can't move policymakers, and that has worked for us. But the influence part is what really has me worried at this point. We live in a much more polarized world. This is not the world when we started in 1998. It's much more polarized. People don't believe in experts anymore, and they don't want to hear from experts anymore. So it used to be that we could come up with ideas, as was mentioned earlier here in the panel, and people would say, oh, well, that's a great, interesting new idea. That might work. Let's try it. People are not interested in new ideas anymore. They have what they think works, whether it be about vaccines or anything else. They're not really interested in what the science says. And so when you're working to influence something and you used to be able to influence it empirically and now that's not working, what does that mean for think tanks? What changes have to come across, and that's a question that I'm struggling with right now. I don't have an answer, but I think it's something that as think tanks we need to think about. I think it would be a failure of imagination for us to go forward doing things in the usual way and not realize that the landscape, there's been a seismic shift in the landscape, and we need to do things differently.
I want to in part echo what you just said. Months ago, the people at Tsinghua University met in London and asked me to give a talk to a group of Chinese people about what was wrong in America. And in preparing for that, I went and looked at data which is produced every April by the Gallup polls. And for the last 20 years, the data was 2004 to 2024. The confidence in academia, the media, experts, legislature, Supreme Court, president, all are down over 20%. And they're not down from 100 to 80. They're from 42 to 20. And so that, what you might call dismissal, or that sense that everybody's playing the wrong game, I think is accurate. If we want to revive things, I think we have to be very conscious of what the cross currents are. And I would encourage everyone to go, it's on a podcast series by a group called The Leveler, which is led by a man named David Sirota, who used to work with Bernie Sanders and who I've known for years. And he did a thing called The Master Plan, which is an 11-hour series on the play-by-play from the Powell memo all the way to 501c4 and what you might call unrestricted, undeclared, massive amounts of money in politics. Understanding that, what I remember saying to David when he embarked on it, what you're doing right now is you are preparing to go to the equivalent of St. Peter's Gate and say, in my life, I did the right thing. And I think we have to learn not to be frightened and therefore argumentative and hostile, but I think we have to learn how to be courageous and explore what the real structures are that have led to this disintegration of belief, confidence, and work on that restoration. And it's not, in many ways, about just a good paper. I want to encourage you all to pick up a book about a man named Milton Erickson. He taught something called neuro-linguistic programming, and it is about the psychology of dealing in turmoil and conflict. And I was once told by a man who was speaking at a dinner in Berkeley, California. His name, he writes the Dilbert column, the cartoon. Scott Adams is his name. And he said, Steve Jobs and the famous life coach Tony Robbins and I took the course together from Milton Erickson's disciple. And Donald Trump was trained by Tony Robbins with this. And if you understand, there's a book called Speaking Ericksonian by a man named Nungard that everybody says is it's about the process of when people are in despair, how you can interact with them and try to bring back the confidence. And it's not just by self-declaration of being an expert. It's about understanding their woundedness and moving forward. And I think that the idea that when I was speaking earlier of creating a void by Democrats neglecting dealing with the conflict that is causing the pain created the opportunity for Donald Trump to use those techniques and bring people to his side. I think understanding his techniques is a necessary precondition for regaining the energy on our side. And I'm not talking about Democrat versus Republican at all. I'm talking about what you might call earnest, rigorous, deep scholarship versus what you might call entangling people emotionally.
Not sure I've got anything to add because the questions were essentially about think tanks, so I'll come back later.
I think questions, I guess one I think about a lot is the question you asked about sort of the, I mean, in a sense, like this whole conversation, and certainly what I've said, you go back decades ago, go read like the founding materials of why places like Brookings and CFR started. We need a continuing conversation of the elite to come up with better expertise and ideas to feed a flow of information because policymakers are moving quickly and they need analysis and expertise. And then go read the newspaper. And there's something that feels really quaint and outdated about that mission. And that comes a little bit to be like, who's on the receiving end of that and who is open to that? And in order to move the needle on policy change, you need to not just have, good ideas, you need to know how to make movements happen and build support for something. And, right now in the energy world, we're seeing power prices rise. Most of energy has been about oil and gas prices for a long time, but electricity prices are front and center now and growing demand for AI and stuff. So you can clearly see that on the left, it's we're going to latch on to affordability as the way to build political support for whatever we want to build it for. And there are a lot of and we're using the word think tank also in a pretty broad way. So we're talking about a lot of different things. There are the sort of fundamental research analytic organizations. And then there are ones that have, and probably may have a 501c4 as well as a 501c3 and are trying to engage in political activity. And I think we both need more of that, but I think it makes the first part, and what I've tried to do, and what many of us try to do, like even more important. Because what I was worried about is like once you've built that political momentum, what are you channeling it toward? Like what are you trying to do? What's the policy change you are advocating or trying to mobilize people to march in the streets over? And the difference between what gets people excited or what sells politically, and then what actually solves the problem you're trying to solve, lowering greenhouse gas emissions or something else, those may not be the same thing. And I still think you fundamentally need like sources of analysis that come without a predetermined view. I worry even about classifying some of these groups we're talking about as progressive, as one of the questions did, or conservative. It almost, again, like that suggests there, and we would never say we have an institutional view. So individual scholars can have whatever view they want to have. That's another difference in some of these organizations. But you're approaching a question with an open mind, analytically, without a predetermined view. And I think in our respective fields of expertise, we all sort of know if you see a scholar, often it might be an academic, and you read a piece of analysis, but you kind of know, like, I can think of academics in my field who were like really, you could tell they viewed part of their goal as to get the Inflation Reduction Act passed. And then when you would read an op-ed they would write, I would be like, who can I check that with? And like that instinct is like the fundamental opposite instinct of what is needed for the kind of think tank we've tried to build and I think is still needed, and of what academic research is supposed to be. And I think that kind of approach and trust, for the word you used, we both used, I think it remains critically important.
Before I open it up to answer your question over there, I think one thing, especially for these more academic-oriented think tanks, is that we need to get our research questions from the field and not from the literature. Like often when we're taught, when we go to grad school, what's the next innovation you can make in the literature? And so you're looking to the literature for research questions for research problems. But a successful think tank has to ask Lori Wallach, has to ask the Brazilian government, has to ask, what are the questions that they're struggling with that they don't have the time or the expertise to do. That's sort of the first thing. And the second thing, you have to invest in strategic communications. We have a secret motto in our center that we research, regurgitate, and recycle. We won't engage on policy unless something's published in a peer-reviewed journal article. But if Lori brings you down to Washington and you're going to brief a congressional staffer, you start whipping out equations, either that person or Lori is going to hit you over the head. And so you've got to train yourself and other academics on how to communicate the findings and their implications in a much different way than we do through our credentialing mechanisms. And then the third thing is the term that you need, that you said, is that you have to have what the great sociologist Peter Evans called embedded autonomy. You've got to have that autonomy. But I think it was Glenn Hubbard today who said that his dissertation advisor said, hey, you got to get out there. You got to be talking to these people, right? You can't just look at the blackboard and look at the literature and say, what's the next article here? You've really got to be out there and engaging with policymakers and CSOs. Looks like we do have time for one more round, and I'll let you be the first responder in one more round. Let me just get more stuff on the table. All right.
I think one of the most important things to study right now is how you disseminate what you've created. Things like Tristan Harris's movie, The Social Dilemma. He used to work at Google, and he became very concerned. Or a gentleman who's a professor at NYU now, used to be at UPenn, Jonathan Haidt, and how children learn and how adults consume. In other words, we need to be conscious of these pathways, how to learn from them, and how to put things that are persuasive on them. And this is a very different thing than Washington Post, New York Times, and CBS. It's a different world now.
Yes, you go first.
Thank you. Ibrahim Patel from South Africa. I'd like to get the panel's views on conservative-leaning think tanks. In your view, have there been, or let me put it more neutrally, what do you think has been the impact, their impact on shaping public policy? What do they do differently from progressive think tanks? Is there anything that can be learned from them?
Well, I'd like to bring here the reflection from the European Union side regarding the issues you raised. Very many thanks for the panel inputs. By saying the following, that if you can comment this, I would be very grateful. Is about what we can call the art of think tanking. The major challenge, you refer to this, is to bridge between intellectual world and the policy-making world. So this means that the think tankers, they need to understand both worlds and both languages to understand how each of these worlds defines the problem, and then in order to look for a possible solution, there is a critical moment we can refer as the moment of reframing. And I'm sure that you understand what I'm speaking about, because your experiences reflect exactly this. All this is important for think tanks to provide quality advice for policy making. We know this very well from our experience. Nevertheless, it seems to me that the role of think tanks in the current circumstances needs to go further. It's not enough to provide quality advice to policymakers. This is extremely important, difficult, challenging, but this is not enough. Because what we have is, in fact, a kind of, I can call this a battle for the minds, with new tools in this battle for the minds. And so the role of think tanks in advocacy, in influence public opinion, is also as much as important. In Europe, we start developing a discipline which is now called narratology, based on cognitive sciences, neurosciences, linguistics, because on the top of this we have different languages, exactly to reach out different audiences. And our starting point is to identify the different narratives which are present in the public debate, in order for us to come with a more convincing narrative. So this is a very important work to be performed by think tanks. On the top of this, I think we need to prepare ourselves for a new challenge coming, which is AI. Because we see this by using chat boxes. They provide a sketch of possible policy advice. They are also able to identify different narratives. And I'm sorry to say that. I think we have basically three big types of think tanks: the mainstream, conservative, the progressive, and now the more far-right think tanks. And to tell you frankly, I think those who have understood all these phases of the supply chain, up to narratives, public opinion, better are the far-right ones. They are better equipped for this. So I think we are in face of a big challenge. And that's why, frankly, I think that progressive think tanks should find other ways to exchange experience and to cooperate at international level, to deal with this, something I'm calling the battle for the minds.
Barry here and Kaushik in the beginning. For the sake of time, since you've been able to get your words in and a bunch of other sessions, I'm just going to let these two go and have the last word.
Okay, thank you. I'm Barry Herman. I wanted to ask a question about financing. And these, there's of course, a whole range of think tanks, and here we're talking about progressive think tanks, I guess, pretty universally here. So I want to ask about the financing. I was at one point on the board of a research NGO or think tank called Global Integrity, and what we did was evaluate governments on the integrity and both in law and in practice. And we worked with social scientists, but also investigative journalists. And we felt that we just couldn't take money from any government, right? And retain our own credibility. So I wonder if there are any restrictions or guidelines or views among these other think tanks about who you take your money from, who you owe what to, etc. Thank you.
Yeah. My question is about communication of ideas. Having spent 7 years in the policy world, at times you get alarmed at the power of how you communicate. So not just the kind of research you've done, how well you've done. We in academia like to believe that in the long run, it's the content of what you've done that wins over. But the short run can be overwhelming. And at times I feel it's also a bit related to Ibrahim's question, that different kinds of think tanks may use very different techniques of communication, and that can make a huge impact. I'm just curious about your experience.
We'll start with you this time.
Just reflecting, it's interesting to me that there's so much categorization of progressive and conservative or even far right it's just not how I think about the only categorizations of think tanks. So I do think, that kind of origin story of think tanks have independent, policy-relevant research organizations approaching research questions with a kind of scholarly temperament of open-mindedness is still really important. And there are still think tanks, maybe not as enough, for whom that is how they define their mission. And then there did, obviously, over recent decades, emerge sort of a different kind of class of think tanks that had advocacy as much as part of their DNA and their mission as research. And then I think comes to the question someone asked about sort of what conservative, what makes them more effective. And even there's a broad range, right? There's serious people doing good thinking at a place like the Hoover Institution or something, and then there are certain institutions that, there's a whole spectrum, and maybe Heritage was one of the early ones or something. So I just think it's hard to paint with a broad brush sort of the idea of think tank. And what I think about is sort of, again, like predetermined conclusions, like ideological direction, and sort of an agenda before one starts the research that sort of defines, puts people in like a different group. And they're hugely influential, probably maybe more on the right than the left. And we saw Project 2025 or something else, like a whole agenda come out that really helps to shape the narrative and set the course for what organizations are going to do. They're maybe more effective at communications, and I absolutely agree that we need to not just be thinking about New York Times op-eds and not just social media, but TikTok videos and a range of different ways to communicate knowledge in today's world. The question of AI is really important. Like something a place like, say, CFR, I think has done quite well is having easily accessible briefing papers. What is this Gaza conflict all about? You can find like pretty good basic information that people have put together to provide educational materials for people. how important is that kind of basic briefing material in a world where AI can produce a lot of that? And the question is it producing it accurately, and who can check it, and who do you trust to do that? And they're pretty well funded, so that helps the conservative think tanks a lot, which comes to the question of funding. And the majority of our funding comes from high net worth individuals who I think donate with a traditionally philanthropic mission, because they think the mission I tried to describe earlier was important and inspiring. There are foundations that, obviously provide funding for research and do the grant applications and everything else. And then a small amount comes from companies, always unrestricted, never directed toward particular uses. Nothing is promised in return. It's just unrestricted, sort of. It's like membership, almost like CFR, like kind of a membership program and invited to events and stuff. But the research is completely independent, and I think has to be in all cases. We certainly operate that way every day.
I wanted to make a comment on the art or the craft of think tanks or academics wanting to influence public policy. Sometimes it will be repeat experiences, and I think it's a really important thing that if it didn't work in the right way, it wasn't framed properly, or we didn't have the right responses, keep a note of it to revisit. You'll revisit. It will come back better and different. Think about it being rejected with an economics article by 4 journals, and you get 3 referees' reports and say, nah. Well, then you've got 3 extra things to put in the next version, and then by the time you get to your 4th version of it, it's pretty good, because they've had so much input. And that's one of the critical things about public policy. At least it was my experience, not really knowing what was going on, but then learning things on the job and keeping a note of them. And it particularly mattered when these institutions are different or the institutions change. And this comes back to Joe. At the conference in 2013, Joe talked about the transactions costs, and we knew that the collection of the income contingent loan in Australia was trivial. And because it's employer withholding, you're just adding it onto income tax collection. I mean, the overall costs are the Japanese higher education minister came to see our system, and I said, come and meet the tax people who collected and the educational people, and she did, because it's very important that you get on with these people and understand where they're coming from. And she said at the meeting, how many people does it take to run this system? And the guy chairing it said, 17. And she said, oh, only 17,000. That's pretty good. He said, no, 17. There's 5 here and there's 12 out there, but they don't have very much to do. And this idea of the importance of transactions cost was picked up beautifully by Joe at that conference. And I saw it again and again and again. I should have seen it before, but I didn't, and thank you. When you try to engage in Bill Clinton's version of an income contingent loan, which started in 1994, it's almost impossible. My PhD student and I decided we'd enroll in the system. And what you had to do was, talk about your income, employer addresses, tax paid over the last 5 years, get the local minister of religion, your doctor, and some family friend who was a well-known politician to endorse your character, and every year you had to redo it again. After 3 days, I called him up and I said, I give up. I mean, I know a lot about student loans, but I cannot enroll in the US student loan system. And I'd read these papers which said the big problem with the US system was that people have trouble filling in the forms. Well, I would ignore that. Well, that's not economics. Let's talk about the efficiency issues and the distributional issues. But that was fundamental. And one other illustration of this. So we took this, the whole idea of income contingent loans in other countries has become quite important. And in South America, we've introduced it, or a pilot in Colombia, and also in Chile. If you go down, I do this all the time now, thanks to Joe. I go down to the ISATEX loan office. It's a normal time-based collection loan, not income contingent. And no matter what time you go at 8 o'clock in the morning, there'll be a queue of 500 people. And they're there because they're pleading for their loan obligation to be forgiven for this month. If you've got income contingency, all done immediately. The transactions cost are huge. We fell in a big heap in Malaysia because I made the terrible mistake when we talked to the head of the Malaysian Student Loan Office. Me and my colleague were there, and there were thousands of people working there. I said, you know what? With an income contingent loan and employer withholding, you won't need this many people. That was the end of us. I mean, please go back to Australia now and never come back. Her function and her role was a protection of that institution. It was not about getting policy progressive and fair. So be very thoughtful and sensitive about this. I wasn't. I think I'm better at it now. But there's a little memo in my brain which says, don't do that again, Bruce. And do take account of things you hadn't thought about before, like transactions costs. So it's a learning process. It'll be different in every country, but just keep a check on what you learn because it'll come up again.
Ravi. A number of quick things. One, you talked about AI. AI has potential, and AI has what you might call the danger of displacement. I have a 16-year-old daughter who said, Dad, why would I ever go spend $70,000 a year and get big debts for a college education and then be replaced by an AI machine? And she showed me a graph of how the starting salaries of college graduates relative to people who don't go to college is collapsing. And so, but I also think we don't want to be encapsulated by the fear. We want to use those possibilities. Another side effect related to AI is that it requires a tremendous amount of energy to operate AI systems all over the world. And that has ramifications for climate change that are not solved at this juncture. I know some people like Jeff Bezos and others are trying to invent or fund the invention of nuclear reactors. There's a lot of work going on at my alma mater, MIT, on that. But I think there's a lot of anxiety related to that. For my final thought, I want to say, first of all, thank you all that I am invigorated by seeing all of you coming together and, how do I say, in this turbulent time and searching for something to do. I want to make two more recommendations for readings because I think they help us understand the challenge. The first is a book that a gentleman who's a good friend of mine called me and asked me to help him create. A little bit like Binaifer talked about earlier, George Soros was traumatized in Hungary as a child. And in Vienna, Martin Wolf from the FT was traumatized. And he said to me, his mother didn't know his father yet, but was from Vienna, went to London. Father went to London. They had 2 children, Martin and his brother, and everybody else in their family tree was destroyed. And he asked me to be a proofreader and give him feedback on a book called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. He put it out, I believe, in 2023, excuse me. And it's about the turmoil that's happening in this capitalist world now and the anxiety that we have to, which you might call, tame or rise to the awareness of and solve so that we don't go back into an authoritarian Nazi-like context. The other book, which I think is just fabulous in this realm, is written by a man who used to be a professor when I was a graduate student at Princeton, named David Abraham. And the name of the book is The Collapse of the Weimar Republic. And it is a beautifully deep thing that, how do I say, David explored. He's of the Jewish faith. He left academia several years after that because people were criticizing him and so forth. And he now works as a lawyer in Miami. But it's the best book I've read because I have ancestors and grandmothers and stuff that came from Stuttgart, and family that ran a brewery with mostly Jewish employees, and they all moved to Louisville, Kentucky, and brought everybody with them to get away from the Nazis. But that book isn't just about then. It's about the taste that we're starting to feel and experience today, and how to recognize that and how to help our world move away from those tragic outcomes, I think is the essence of the purpose that I experience when I'm around all of you.
I think your question is vital. It goes to really the core of what we've been talking about, and I'll use it very quickly. I know we're at the end. I'll use it very quickly as my closing thought. I go back to this issue of how do we influence now? It used to be, and some of us are still talking about, we'll get some smart people together and we'll figure this out and we'll bring it out. But I don't think that's how it works anymore. It's used to be people thought, tariffs are not a great thing. They're paid by the people in the country, and now there's a completely different point of view about things like that and everything else. So it's no longer about, let's get together in a room and let's figure something out and let's see what's good. It's a completely different situation. So given that landscape, how do we influence now? Who do we go to? How do we do it? I think it's a tremendous change, and I think it needs to be the topic of further study and further talk. But I think it's a consequential, existential moment, I think, for think tanks right now.
Kaushik, you said in the long run you hope that folks are finally going to find out what happened, but as you know, because you're a great economist, that Keynes said in the long run we're all dead, and in the short run there's all these other means of communication. And so that's why I think it's really important, and the best think tanks invest just as much in the strategic communications as they do in the research itself. So we have to play the same game, as Jason said, and none of us are trained for it. And we don't have the incentives, especially the university-based kind of think tanks, that we don't have the incentives to do that. And those are big cultural hurdles. And I guess no one very wanted to talk about funding, but that is one of the most hard things. You did. There's for universities, we have the opportunity. We have alumni giving, which a lot of the more sort of the Brookings and so forth. They're a different breed. Brookings and CFR also get sort of individual donors or memberships. But so that's one column, and then it's philanthropy or governments, and different think tanks have different strategies. And somebody else asked, how do you do something without being beholden? And it's a difficult thread to tightrope on. Since everyone's assigning books, there's a book by Daniel Dresner from the Fletcher School, a rival of SIPA, called The Ideas Industry. And it's the only real strong book that really looks at think tanks across the world and how they're changing. And one of the reasons why they're changing is because of the revenue model. You see things now like the Rhodium Group, which is 50% the traditional kind of think tank, but then they do for-profit kind of work, et cetera. It's an interesting book about our field, and given the fact that we can have this conversation forever, but it's time to close, I recommend that book. I want to really thank all of the panelists that we have, thank all of you for the great conversations that we've had, and I guess, Gabrielle, you can tell us what we're up to now, or somebody on